Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first night I heard it breathing was when I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. Not the casual error of buying an overpriced souvenir, but the kind of mistake that reshapes reality into something unrecognizable. The doll watches me even without eyes, a blank, featureless head turning imperceptibly whenever I look away. I brought something back with me from New Orleans that wasn't meant to leave, and now I'm paying a different kind of tax altogether. The market stall had been tucked away in an alley so narrow my shoulders nearly brushed both walls. Heavy air, thick with humidity and the scent of spices, clung to my skin as I wandered through the French Quarter, already half drunk on cheap bourbon and cheaper promises. Tourism had been my escape from the mounting pressures back home. 3 months of ignored tax notices, a pending audit, and a life slowly unraveling around financial negligence. The old woman behind the stall barely acknowledged me. Her fingers, gnarled like ancient cypress roots, worked methodically, weaving something small from coarse burlap. Only when I reached for a painted mask did she finally speak, her voice a rasp that seemed to rise from somewhere beneath the cobblestones. "Not that," she murmured, never looking up. "This one calls to you." She extended her palm, offering a crude, faceless doll no larger than my thumb. Bald, featureless, with crude stitching forming its miniature body. Something about its emptiness, the suggestion of features that should have been there but weren't, made my stomach tighten. "What is it?" I asked, already reaching for my wallet. Her response was a series of words I didn't understand, spoken in a dialect that slid between French and something older. The only word I recognized was debts. When I asked her to repeat herself, she merely smiled, revealing teeth filed to points, and wrapped the doll in a scrap of newspaper covered with tax code printouts. I should have known then. I should have walked away. Instead, I clipped the tiny doll to my backpack zipper like a macabre charm and continued my vacation, forgetting about it entirely until I returned home to my apartment in Chicago 3 days later. The first change was subtle. I'd been home 2 days, jet-lagged and avoiding the stack of mail that had accumulated during my absence. Bills, notices, another letter from the IRS demanding my quarterly payment. That night, lying in bed, I heard it, a soft whispering from beneath the floorboards. Not the usual settling of the building or the radiator kicking on, but rhythmic, intentional sounds that almost formed words. Cajun phrases, Creole incantations, numbers spoken in sequence, like someone reciting tax codes. I convinced myself it was the lingering effects of travel, my mind playing tricks after too many late nights in jazz clubs. But when I rose the next morning and spotted my backpack hanging by the door, the doll attached to it seemed different. Still faceless, still crude, but undeniably larger. What had been the size of my thumb now stretched to the length of my index finger. I told myself I simply hadn't looked at it properly before. Vacation memories are often distorted, especially when alcohol is involved. I removed it from my backpack and placed it on my desk, next to the IRS notice I was determinedly ignoring. That evening, after another day of procrastination, I filed for a tax extension, my third this year. The moment I clicked submit on the electronic form, the whispering beneath the floor intensified. This time there was no mistaking it for house noises. Raspy syllables bubbled up through the gaps between the floorboards, along with the faint scent of swamp water and burning herbs. Sleep came fitfully that night. In the morning the doll had grown another centimeter, and the stitches along its side pulsed with a sickening rhythm, like veins carrying black blood. By the 5th day, panic had settled into my bones. Each morning, the doll grew larger. Each night, the whispering grew louder. I began measuring it with a ruler, documenting the impossible. Exactly 1 centimeter of growth every 24 hours. The crude stitching along its body had become more pronounced, the threads now visibly throbbing whenever I approached with my tax documents in hand. I'm not superstitious by nature. I'm an accountant, a man of numbers and rational explanations. But rationality offers no framework for a doll that grows. for whispers in a language you don't speak but somehow understand, is counting down your financial sins. I tried to destroy it first. Scissors wouldn't cut it. Fire wouldn't burn it. Water beaded off its surface like mercury. When I attempted to trash it, wrapping it in layers of garbage bags, I found it sitting on my bedside table the next morning, now the size of my hand, its blank face somehow conveying accusation. The internet offered contradictory advice about voodoo dolls. Some sites suggested salt, purification, banishment. Others warned against interfering with forces beyond understanding. Desperate, I opted for salt, purchasing a large container of coarse sea salt from the grocery store. That night, I created a circle of salt around the doll and sprinkled more directly onto its burlap body. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The doll convulsed, the stitching along its side splitting open. From the wound emerged dozens of pins, not falling out but shooting outward like projectiles, trailing thin wisps of sulfurous smoke. I ducked but wasn't fast enough. The pins didn't pierce my flesh. Something far worse happened instead. They shot past me and embedded themselves in my shadow on the wall, pinning it like a butterfly specimen. My physical body remained mobile, but my shadow stayed fixed, stretched and distorted where the pins held it fast. The disconnect created an immediate wave of nausea. Moving while your shadow remains still violates something primal in human perception. Each step I took away from the wall sent shooting pains through my body, as if I were stretching myself beyond natural limits. Wild with panic, I grabbed at my shadow, my fingers somehow finding purchase on what should have been merely an absence of light. The shadow felt cold and slick, like wet silk. When I tore it free from the pins, pain exploded through my right shoulder, real physical agony that sent me to my knees. Behind me, my shadow reattached itself, but moved with a slight delay, as if reluctant to follow my commands. Blood soaked through my shirt, though there was no wound beneath the fabric, only a perfect constellation of bruises in the exact pattern of the pins that had pierced my shadow. 2 weeks after returning from New Orleans, the doll stood knee-high, its blank face now level with my desk. I'd given up attempting to destroy it, and instead established a wary coexistence. It remained mostly motionless during the day, but at night, I would wake to find it had moved, always closer to my bed, always oriented toward me regardless of how I'd left it. The whispering had become a constant companion, rising from the floorboards throughout the day but reaching a crescendo whenever I engaged with anything financial, checking my bank account, opening bills, calculating how much I owed in back taxes and penalties. My shoulder ached constantly where my shadow had been torn. The bruises refused to fade, occasionally weeping a clear fluid that smelled of the Mississippi. I began wearing long sleeves regardless of the temperature, unable to explain the injury to co-workers already concerned about my deteriorating appearance. Sleep deprivation and constant anxiety had hollowed my face. Dark circles framed eyes that darted nervously, always seeking the doll's location. I called in sick frequently, unable to concentrate on spreadsheets when my home had become a prison shared with something increasingly malevolent. Then came the receipts. I woke one morning to find the doll, now reaching my hip, holding a stack of paper in its crudely stitched hands. Receipts, dozens of them, for purchases I hadn't made. A car scheduled for delivery next month. A vacation property in Florida closing in 2 weeks. Luxury watches, designer clothing, first-class flights, all dated in the future, all bearing my signature and credit card information. My bank accounts showed no such charges, yet. But the doll held these future receipts like promissory notes, evidence of financial ruin still in transit. When I tried to take them, they dissolved into ash that reformed in the doll's grip moments later. I attempted to ignore it, focusing instead on finally addressing my tax situation. I gathered my documents, calculated what I owed, and prepared to submit payment for the full amount plus penalties. As I reached for my laptop, the doll began rhythmically banging its featureless head against my apartment door. Each impact left rust-colored stains in the perfect shape of dollar signs. The metallic pounding synchronized with my heartbeat, growing faster and louder as I moved through the payment screens. Blood rushed in my ears, nearly drowning out the Cajun whispers that now seemed to come not just from the floor but from the walls, the ceiling, from inside my own head. My fingers trembled above the submit payment button. Behind me, the pounding intensified, the door creaking under the assault. I hit submit. Silence fell immediately, broken only by the soft ping of my payment confirmation. When I turned, the doll had vanished. Relief lasted precisely 8 hours. I returned from work, my first full day back in weeks, to find the apartment transformed. Every surface was covered with receipts, thousands of them, all for future purchases, all bearing my signature. They papered the walls, covered the floors, hung from the ceiling on strings of what looked disturbingly like sinew. In the center of the living room stood the doll, now nearly reaching my chest. Its blank face was turned upward, featureless save for a single vertical tear where a mouth should be. From this new orifice emerged sounds that were no longer whispers but full words, spoken in perfect, unaccented English. "The principal is always paid in full," it said, its voice simultaneously childlike and ancient. "But interest compounds eternally." My legs gave way beneath me. The room spun as understanding crashed through my consciousness. This wasn't about my tax evasion, that had merely been the entry point, the small negligence that allowed something through. This was about debt of a different kind, about cosmic ledgers I'd never known existed. The doll extended its arm, offering a single receipt different from the others. This one was handwritten on parchment that looked suspiciously like skin, the ink rusty brown rather than black. At the top, where a company name would normally appear, was a symbol I recognized from the New Orleans shop, the old woman's mark. "You purchased what wasn't for sale," the doll said, the tear widening with each word. "The debt transfers. The collection continues." Cold clarity washed through me. I wasn't the first. The old woman hadn't been the seller, but the previous debtor, passing her burden to an unwitting tourist with financial negligence already staining his soul. How many before her? How far back did this chain of debt reach? I had two choices. Continue this cycle of terror until the doll reached my size, and I found myself compelled to pass it to another negligent soul, or break the pattern somehow. My tax debt was paid, but this ledger required something else entirely. 3 days later, I returned to New Orleans, the doll, now reaching my shoulders, strapped into the passenger seat beside me. The drive had been a nightmare of whispered calculations and growing receipts that filled the car faster than I could push them aside. Several times I nearly drove off the road as the doll turned its blank face toward me, the mouth tear widening to reveal nothing but empty burlap inside. The French Quarter hadn't changed, but I navigated its streets with new awareness. The narrow alley was exactly where I remembered, though it seemed to constrict further as I approached, the buildings on either side leaning inward as if reluctant to permit my passage. The stall was gone. In its place was a faded outline on the cobblestones, a perfect rectangle of cleaner stones where it had stood for what must have been years. Despair threatened to overtake me until I noticed a small door in the wall I hadn't seen during my previous visit. No handle adorned its surface, just a small indentation the exact shape and size of the doll's head. Understanding washed through me. I positioned the doll, pressing its blank face into the indentation. The fit was perfect. Stone ground against stone as the door swung inward, revealing a small room containing nothing but a wooden chair and an ancient ledger open on a podium. The doll stepped forward independently, its crude legs carrying it to the ledger. It lifted a hand, now equipped with a single pointed finger that hadn't existed before, and began to write in script I couldn't read from where I stood. As it wrote, the doll began to shrink, centimeter by centimeter, reverting back toward its original size. The receipts that had followed us disintegrated, turning to ash that swirled in patterns too deliberate to be caused by the gentle draft from the open door. I knew without being told what was happening. The doll was calculating a transfer, not to another person, but back to its source. My debt was being returned to whatever cosmic accountant had first issued it, but nothing comes without cost. When the doll finished writing, now no larger than my hand again, it turned its blank face toward me. The tear mouth opened one final time. Balance requires balance, it said. The debt is returned, but payment is still due. My shadow separated from me again, this time without pins or force, a gentle detachment like silk sliding from skin. It moved of its own accord, flowing across the floor to the ledger, where it pressed itself to the page the doll had written on. The shadow sank into the paper, absorbed completely, leaving me standing in the small room casting no darkness at all. I felt lighter immediately, weightless almost, but also diminished. Colors seemed less vibrant, sounds muted, as if I now experienced the world through a thin veil. I reached for the doll, now inanimate and object-like again, and placed it in my pocket. When I emerged from the alley, people on the street walked through me as if I wasn't there. Their shadows, however, reached toward me, stretching unnaturally across the cobblestones, fingers of darkness straining in my direction. I understood the exchange that had been made. My financial debt, both mundane and mystical, had been settled. But in return, I had become something else. Not quite ghost, not quite physical, but a collector of a different sort. The doll in my pocket was now mine to give, and I found myself studying passers-by, somehow able to sense which ones carried the weight of unpaid debts, which ones tried to cheat their way through life's ledgers. There would always be another debtor. There would always be balance to maintain, and I had all the time in the world to wait for the right one. In an apartment in Chicago, mail piles up uncollected. The neighbors report occasionally hearing Cajun whispers seeping through the walls, but no one has lived there for months. Tax season approaches, and throughout the city, people procrastinate on their filings, unaware that in doing so they open doors to ledgers beyond their comprehension. In the French Quarter, tourists browse for souvenirs, occasionally feeling a weightless hand guiding them toward certain stalls, certain trinkets. Some leave with small faceless dolls they don't remember purchasing, small enough to clip to a backpack, easy to forget until the whispering begins. Story 2. The human mind isn't designed to comprehend certain things. Science has boundaries for a reason. I learned this truth in my basement laboratory, where the laws of chemistry collided with something older, something that waited patiently behind the veil of reason until I was foolish enough to invite it in. I've always dismissed the supernatural as the desperate rationalization of minds too weak to accept randomness. But after what happened, I'm no longer certain where the line between science and the unexplainable truly lies, or if such a line exists at all. The university's chemistry department had always been underfunded. When my grant application for lab space was denied for the third consecutive time, I decided to take matters into my own hands. The basement of my Victorian-era home offered ample square footage, solid concrete floors, and most importantly, isolation. Perfect for the sensitive experiments I was conducting on molecular restructuring under extreme temperature variations. It took 2 months to convert the space. I installed industrial-grade ventilation, reinforced the electrical system, and meticulously arranged my equipment with the precision of a surgeon preparing an operating theater. My pride was the custom-built fume hood, where I spent most of my waking hours. The renovation consumed my savings, but I couldn't put a price on scientific freedom. The only eyesore was the ancient heating system that dominated the far corner, a behemoth of corroded metal that wheezed and groaned with irregular cadence. My colleagues joked about it during their infrequent visits, claiming they could see faces in the rust patterns. Jenkins from organic chemistry even named it Old Kelvin, and insisted it watched him work. I tolerated their superstitious nonsense with thinly veiled contempt. Science had no room for ghost stories. The equation had been haunting me for weeks, a seemingly straightforward problem in molecular bonding energies that stubbornly refused resolution. Every attempt ended in mathematical contradiction or physical impossibility. My frustration mounted as each late night bled into early morning, with nothing to show but a throbbing headache and sheets of discarded calculations. On that particular night, a November storm lashed against the basement windows like something desperate to get in. The wind found every crack in the century-old foundation, creating a symphony of whispers that seemed almost articulate. The temperature had dropped precipitously, and I'd cranked up the ancient heater to its maximum setting. It responded with a series of metallic protests that echoed through the concrete chamber. At exactly 2:47 a.m., I hit another dead end with the equation. I hurled my pen across the room, watching it ricochet off the periodic table poster and disappear behind a cabinet. Sleep deprivation had worn my patience thin. The heater chose that moment to emit a particularly human-sounding groan. "Shut up," I muttered, massaging my temples. "I'm not in the mood for your commentary." The heater responded with a series of clicks, almost like laughter. I stood up, stretching my cramped muscles, and approached the rusted monstrosity. Weeks of isolation and mathematical frustration had frayed the edges of my rationality. I found myself facing the heater, addressing it directly as if confronting a rival. "Fine, old Kelvin. If you're such a brilliant entity, why don't you solve my equation?" My voice echoed in the empty lab, unnaturally loud. "Everyone says you're watching. Prove you're more than just corroded metal and faulty wiring." The challenge hung in the stale air. I felt ridiculous almost immediately, a grown man taunting a piece of equipment. But then, the storm abruptly ceased. The sudden silence pressed against my eardrums with physical weight. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite the heat. The lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the laboratory into absolute darkness. I froze, counting seconds by my racing heartbeat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The lights snapped back on with clinical brightness. Everything appeared exactly as before, except for two critical details. First, the wall clock now displayed 3:15, though my wristwatch insisted it was still 2:47. Second, the whiteboard where I'd been working for hours now showed my equation, fully resolved, in what was unmistakably my own handwriting. My mouth went dry. I approached the whiteboard with trembling steps, examining the solution. Each variable was perfectly balanced, each calculation flawless. It was elegant, beautiful even, but impossible. I hadn't written it. Yet there it was, in the distinctive way I form my sevens with a cross stroke, my peculiar habit of writing square brackets at sharp angles. I reached for the eraser, determined to wipe away this inexplicable intrusion. The moment my fingers touched the surface, an invisible force seized my hand. The eraser adhered to the board like it had been magnetized, my fingers unable to release it. A cold sensation spread from my fingertips up my arm, a penetrating chill that bypassed skin and muscle to settle directly in my bones. After 3 excruciating seconds, the force released me. I stumbled backward, clutching my hand to my chest. My fingertips had turned a bloodless white, as if something had drained all warmth from them. The equation remained, untouched and perfect. I fled upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. Sleep was impossible. I paced my living room until dawn, trying to construct rational explanations for what had happened. Sleep deprivation, hallucination. Perhaps I'd solved the equation myself and forgotten in my exhausted state. When morning arrived with its cleansing sunlight, I convinced myself of the latter. I must have had a dissociative episode from overwork. With daylight courage, I descended back to the lab, half expecting to find the whiteboard wiped clean, evidence of a dream. The equation remained, exactly as I'd seen it. But now my scientific curiosity overrode my fear. I photographed the solution and spent the day verifying each step. The mathematics was sound. In fact, it was brilliant, an approach I'd never have conceived. After hours of analysis, I remembered the security camera I'd installed near my computer station, primarily to document experiments when I worked alone. With shaking hands, I accessed the previous night's footage. What I saw defies explanation. The recording showed me seated at my desk during the 5 seconds of darkness, completely motionless except for my eyes. They rotated independently of each other, twisting at physically impossible angles before rolling back in their sockets. Meanwhile, a blurred figure, barely distinct from the darkness surrounding it, moved from the heater to the whiteboard. It had no defined shape, just a smudge of deeper black against the shadows, but it moved with deliberate intelligence. I watched the footage 17 times, searching for evidence of tampering or digital artifacts. Found none. The timestamp matched exactly 2:47:12 to 2:47:17 a.m., 5 seconds during which something impossible happened. That night, I slept upstairs with all lights blazing, doors locked, and a kitchen knife on my nightstand. I told myself I wouldn't return to the basement. Yet by midday, scientific curiosity had overcome caution. I needed to understand what had happened. I armed myself with additional cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and temperature sensors, transforming my chemistry lab into a paranormal investigation site. My colleagues would have laughed themselves hoarse had they seen me. I didn't care. Something had happened that defied explanation, and I would document it properly. For 2 days, nothing unusual occurred. I worked on applications of the mysterious solution, which proved remarkably effective for predicting bond energies in complex molecular structures. I'd convinced myself the incident was isolated, perhaps triggered by the specific atmospheric conditions of the storm. Until 3:15 a.m. on the third night, I was running a routine analysis when the circuit breaker tripped without warning. Emergency backup lights cast a sickly amber glow across the laboratory. I reached for my flashlight, heart hammering against my ribs. The beam illuminated the path to the breaker panel across the room. Before I could take a step, the temperature plummeted. My breath condensed in front of me, thick white clouds against the amber emergency lighting. A metallic taste filled my mouth, and the air crackled with static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand rigid. The smell hit me next, sharp and acrid like electrical fire, but with an unnatural edge. Burnt ozone, the distinctive scent of air molecules torn apart by excessive energy. I stood paralyzed, flashlight beam trembling across the far wall. Something was moving by the whiteboard, not a physical presence, but a distortion in the air, like heat rising from asphalt in summer. The marker lifted itself from the tray and began writing with violent, jerky movements. New equations appeared, building upon the original solution. The hand holding the marker remained invisible, but the precision was undeniable. These weren't random scribbles. They were advanced chemical formulations for compounds I'd never considered. Theoretical structures with properties that violated conventional understanding. My scientific mind immediately recognized their potential applications. Pharmaceuticals that could cross the blood-brain barrier with unprecedented efficiency, molecular machines that could self-replicate using ambient materials, energy storage systems with capacity beyond anything currently imaginable. And yet, underlying the brilliance was something profoundly wrong. The formulas required toxic precursors, unstable intermediaries, reactions that would release compounds with unknown environmental impacts. Their implementation would require ethical compromises no responsible scientist would make. The marker dropped to the floor with a plastic clatter that echoed like a gunshot in the silent lab. The lights flickered back to life, and the circuit breaker reset itself with an audible click. I approached the whiteboard cautiously. The ink was still wet, glistening under the fluorescent lights. When I leaned closer to examine the formulas, the burnt ozone smell intensified. I reached out to touch the surface, then recoiled. The ink wasn't just wet, it was warm. Body temperature. My cameras had captured everything. The footage showed the marker moving through empty air, guided by nothing visible even when I enhanced the contrast and resolution. More disturbing were the heat signatures. The ink registered at precisely 98.6 degree human body temperature, while the surrounding air had dropped to near freezing. This pattern repeated for weeks. Every night at 3:15 a.m. the power would fail momentarily. New formulas would appear, each more brilliant and ethically questionable than the last. Each time the cameras captured the same phenomenon. Markers moving through empty air, equations written in warm ink that smelled of burnt ozone. I should have fled, should have abandoned the house, destroyed the formulas, reported my findings to someone with the authority to investigate. Instead, scientific ambition overcame my fear. I began testing the formulas, synthesizing compounds predicted by the mysterious equations. The results were extraordinary. Materials with properties that defied conventional physics, chemical reactions that yielded energy outputs far beyond theoretical maximums. Publications followed, academic recognition, grant offers. inquiries from pharmaceutical companies and defense contractors. I became renowned for breakthroughs I didn't fully understand, taking credit for knowledge that wasn't mine. I've stopped questioning the source of these insights, stopped watching the camera footage each morning, stopped noticing how the temperature in the lab drops when I work late, stopped acknowledging the reflection in my computer screen that sometimes moves independently of me, but I feel its presence growing stronger with each formula I implement. Each night at 3:15, I sit motionless at my desk, surrendering control while it uses my hands to write. Sometimes I catch glimpses of it in reflective surfaces, a darkness with purpose, watching from the corner where the ancient heater stands silent now, its purpose fulfilled. It no longer needs to cut the power to make its presence known, no longer needs to move markers through empty air. It has a more direct instrument now. Last night I found myself standing at the whiteboard without remembering how I got there. My hand was writing formulas I didn't recognize, chemical structures of impossible complexity. When I tried to step away, my legs refused to obey. When I tried to drop the marker, my fingers only gripped it tighter. My colleagues still visit occasionally. They comment on my pale complexion, the dark circles under my eyes, the distant quality of my responses. They attribute it to overwork, to the pressure of my sudden fame. They don't notice how I flinch when they mention old Kelvin, or how I steer them away from examining my whiteboard too closely. They don't see what I see in reflective surfaces, my eyes briefly rotating at impossible angles when I work past midnight. They don't smell the burnt ozone that clings to my clothing. They don't feel the cold spot that follows me through the laboratory. I've come to understand the exchange I unknowingly initiated that stormy night. The knowledge wasn't free. With each formula I implement, its influence grows stronger. The boundary between us thins. The line between inspiration and possession blurs. Science has boundaries for a reason. Some equations aren't meant to be solved. Some knowledge comes at a price too steep to calculate. And sometimes, when you challenge the darkness, it accepts. Story 3. The first time I noticed something wrong at Blackwood University's library was when I laughed at the creaking floors. That dismissive chuckle echoes in my nightmares now. A sound that marked me somehow, branded me as worthy of attention from whatever dwells between those endless rows of books. I wish I could take it back, that single moment of arrogant disbelief. But the library remembered, and the library responded. It started with the sounds, not the normal settling of an old building. These were deliberate, rhythmic. Footsteps that stopped when I turned around, pages turning when no one sat at the tables. I'd been spending late nights there researching my dissertation on medieval occultism, often the last student to leave besides the janitors. The sounds followed a pattern, 3 quick successions, pause, then 2 slower ones, like a heartbeat slightly out of sync. Just the heating system, I told myself, just the wood contracting in the cold. Rational explanations that disintegrated with each passing night. I first dreamed of them 3 weeks ago, hooded figures moving between the stacks, their faces obscured in shadow so deep it seemed to swallow light. They moved with purpose, lighting candles at specific intervals along the shelves. The dream was so vivid I could smell the sulfur from the matches, feel the temperature drop as they passed. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to escape. The next night, the same dream, and the next. Each time the figures would light one more candle than before. Each time they would pause and turn toward where I watched, though I could never see their faces. Just darkness where features should be. After the 5th consecutive night, exhaustion clouded my thinking. My academic advisor noticed my bloodshot eyes and suggested I take time off. I nodded mechanically while my mind replayed the latest dream. The hooded figures had arranged their candles in a pattern that looked disturbingly like my initials. Ms. Winters, my advisor, asked if I was sleeping properly. I lied and said yes. How could I explain what was happening without sounding completely unhinged? I avoided the library for 3 days. The dream stopped. Relief washed over me, and I convinced myself it had been simple stress, my mind processing anxiety through bizarre imagery. Nothing supernatural, nothing to fear, When I returned to the library on a Tuesday afternoon, Harriet, the head librarian, greeted me with unusual enthusiasm. She mentioned they'd installed new security cameras the previous weekend. My pulse quickened as she offered to show me the monitoring room, a cluttered closet-sized space with 6 screens showing different angles of the library. "We've captured some interesting footage," she said, her thin lips curving into what might have been a smile. There was something off about her tone, a hint of anticipation that made my skin prickle. She clicked through several recordings, explaining the new system's features, when something on the 3rd screen caught my attention. A figure, my figure, walking between rows of shelves in the medieval history section. The timestamp showed 8:42 p.m. the previous evening. "But I wasn't here last night," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. Harriet's eyes narrowed slightly. "Of course you were. Look." She switched to another camera angle. There I was, seated at my usual table near the tall windows, surrounded by open books. The camera clearly showed my face, illuminated by my laptop screen. I was wearing the same clothes I'd worn 3 days ago, the last time I'd been in the library. But then she toggled back to the first recording. At the exact same timestamp, my doppelganger walked through the stacks, pausing occasionally to run fingers along book spines. My blood turned to ice. "That's impossible," I whispered. Harriet merely shrugged and mentioned something about occasional glitches in the system. Her casualness terrified me more than any dramatic reaction could have. As if she'd expected this, as if she'd seen it before. I stumbled through my research that afternoon, unable to focus. Every few minutes, I'd scan the library, searching for my double. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against my back. Twice, I caught my reflection in the window glass and flinched, momentarily unsure if it was really mine or something else wearing my face. That night, the dreams returned with brutal intensity. The hooded figures moved with greater urgency, their candles now forming complex patterns across the library floor. In the dream, I tried to approach them, but my feet refused to move. One figure separated from the group, walking directly toward me. It raised its hands to its hood, about to reveal what lay beneath, and I woke up screaming, my bedsheets tangled around my legs like binding ropes. I knew I had to go back. Not during operating hours when students and staff filled the space with normalcy, but at night, when whatever was happening might reveal itself fully. I told myself I needed evidence, something concrete to prove I wasn't losing my mind. The more rational explanation, that I was indeed experiencing some kind of psychological break, seemed almost preferable to the alternative. Getting into the building after hours wasn't difficult. As a doctoral candidate, I had late access privileges, though officially we were supposed to leave by midnight. The security guard knew me and barely glanced up from his phone as I swiped my ID card at 11:40 p.m. The library felt different at night. During the day, the vastness of the main reading room felt grand, inspiring. Now it loomed, the tall ceilings disappearing into darkness that the sparse emergency lighting couldn't penetrate. The bookshelves created a labyrinth of shadows, each corner concealing potential threats. I made my way to the medieval history section where the camera had captured my doppelganger. The smell hit me immediately, burnt wax. Not the pleasant aroma of scented candles, but raw tallow, pungent and greasy. No candles were visible, yet the smell permeated everything. My heart rate accelerated as I moved deeper into the stacks. The sound of my breathing seemed obscenely loud in the silence. Then I heard it, a soft fluttering sound, like pages turning. Not a single book, but dozens, hundreds, all turning in perfect synchronization, like wings beating against the air. I followed the sound, weaving through the shelves until I reached the rare manuscript section. The temperature had dropped dramatically. I could see my breath forming clouds in front of my face. The page-turning sound grew louder, more insistent. Then I saw movement at the end of a long corridor, formed by towering bookshelves. My feet carried me forward before my brain could process what I was seeing. It was me, my exact duplicate, standing motionless, holding a large leather-bound volume. Even from a distance, I could see the book's title wasn't printed but carved into the cover, the grooves filled with something dark and flaking. something that looked horribly like dried blood. My doppelganger raised its head, meeting my gaze. Its face, my face, split into a wide smile. But where there should have been a mouth, there was only smooth skin. The sight sent waves of nausea crashing through me. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. It lifted a hand, pointing to something on the floor between us. A candle, melted down to a misshapen lump of wax. The wick, impossibly, had formed letters. My full name, Andrew Michael Blackwood, twisted into a cursive so perfect it couldn't have been accidental. The thing with my face took a step toward me, then another. Its movements were fluid but wrong, like watching footage played slightly too fast. The book it held began to smoke, thin tendrils rising from the pages. Primal fear finally broke my paralysis. I turned and ran, my footsteps thundering against the marble floor. Behind me, I heard the fluttering grow frenzied, thousands of pages turning at once. I reached the main reading room and froze in horror. The bookshelves were moving. Without human intervention, they were sliding across the floor, their wooden bases scraping against marble with a sound like fingernails on chalkboard. They were arranging themselves into a pattern, blocking my path to the exit. A low chanting filled the air, the words in Latin but somehow inverted, as if someone had recorded the phrases and played them backward. The syllables hurt my ears, making it difficult to focus. I recognized fragments from my research, phrases from forbidden texts about duality, about summoning reflections from other realities. The shelves had nearly completed their rearrangement, leaving only a narrow path to the main doors. I sprinted toward it, knowing instinctively that if that gap closed, I would never leave the library again. Behind me, the chanting grew louder. The air felt thick, resistant, as if I were running through water instead of air. My lungs burned, my vision tunneled. I burst through the gap just as the final bookshelf slid into place with a decisive thud. The sound echoed through the empty lobby like a coffin lid closing. The security guard was gone from his post. The exit door stood unlocked, too easy, too inviting. I hesitated only a moment before pushing through them into the cold night air. That was 3 days ago. I haven't returned to campus, haven't answered calls from my advisor. I sit in my apartment with the lights on, afraid of what might wait in the darkness. Last night I found a book on my coffee table that I don't remember owning. A leather-bound volume with no publishing information, no ISBN number. The cover is blank but warm to the touch, as if recently handled. I haven't opened it yet. But sometimes, when I'm not looking directly at it, I see the cover ripple, like something is moving beneath the surface. Waiting. And in the bathroom mirror this morning, for just a moment, my reflection didn't match my movements. It smiled as I frowned. I'm writing this all down as proof, as testament. The library contains something ancient that has noticed me, selected me. I don't know why. My research, perhaps, or simply bad luck. Tonight I'll confront it. I'll return to the library with salt and iron, traditional wards I've read about. I don't know if they'll work against whatever this is, but I can't keep running. Can't keep wondering when my reflection will stop mimicking me and start replacing me. If anyone finds these words and I've disappeared, don't look for me in the usual places. Look for me in the reflections, in the spaces between shelves. Look for me in the library. Just don't look too long. Don't let the library notice you too. Story 4. I woke up that first morning in the rented loft with my heart already pounding, as if I'd been shoved out of sleep by some invisible hand. The air felt stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to my nostrils and refused to let go. Gray light filtered through the high windows, revealing dust motes dancing in the air, and right in the center of the mezzanine floor, the one I'd been told was an architectural statement, there was that unsettling crack in the glass. From the start, it made me feel like I was suspended over a hidden abyss I couldn't quite see. They called it a loft model, a showpiece that the landlord said was perfect for me while my actual apartment was undergoing renovations. I had no idea how accurate that statement would turn out to be. The contract was too good to resist. 6 months, fully furnished, large windows, high ceilings, and a sleek glass mezzanine. It promised convenience. It promised luxury. On the day I moved in, the landlord smirked in a way that made me uneasy, but I brushed it off as excitement or maybe relief that he'd found a tenant so quickly. I remember the first time I noticed the red dust beneath the glass. It looked almost like iron filings, but it was so bright, so vividly crimson, that it reminded me of fresh, powdered rust. It wasn't something that vacuuming or mopping could address because it gathered underneath the floor. Through the crack, I could just make out tiny accumulations of that red grit. I tried to ignore it and focus on the rest of the loft. If I had known how deeply it would burrow into my mind over the following weeks, maybe I would have left right then. But I needed a place to stay, and the price had been too tempting. The loft was an odd mix of industrial charm and half-completed construction. Exposed brick walls framed the living area, while steel beams supported the mezzanine. Each morning I noticed that some of the bricks at floor level seemed slightly dislodged, as if they'd been pushed out from the wall. It was subtle at first, just a single brick leaning forward a fraction of an inch. I thought it might be normal wear and tear or some structural quirk, but by the third or fourth morning these bricks weren't only loose, they were forming shapes, arrows. They pointed out through the windows, always in the direction of another building in the neighborhood. If I followed the path of each arrow, it would line up with a different apartment or office tower or condo complex. At first, I tried to laugh it off. Maybe the building was settling in weird ways, and these patterns were coincidental. Yet something about it gnawed at me. The geometry was too perfect. Each loose brick aligned too precisely to be random. The next day, I found a newspaper on the kitchen counter. It had been delivered without my asking. Inside, I skimmed an article about surging property values in certain local blocks. A wave of queasiness swept through me when I saw a photo of one of the buildings the bricks had been pointing to. According to the article, it was a real estate gold mine. I wondered if I was unconsciously connecting dots that weren't really there. Still, the coincidence set my nerves on edge. I tried to share my unease with a colleague at work. Over coffee, I mentioned that my temporary loft had some odd features. He seemed disinterested, but gave me a dismissive suggestion to just enjoy it while you can. That evening, I returned home determined to ignore the loose bricks and the cracked glass floor. But the moment I stepped inside, I heard a scraping sound in the living room, like stone grinding against stone. My breathing turned shallow. The hair on my arms prickled as I slowly approached the spot. Sure enough, one more brick had shifted. It was sticking out from the wall at an angle, pointing directly toward a building across the street. I couldn't tear my eyes away. I felt a surge of adrenaline, heart hammering in my chest like a warning. When I finally forced myself to look up, I saw the reflection of my own face in the glass floor above. I looked pale and haunted, like a man whose sleep was being chipped away bit by bit. By the time a week had passed, I was cleaning the mezzanine daily. No matter how diligently I wiped down the glass, that crack continued to reveal a swirl of red dust beneath the surface. Each day, the dust gathered in slightly different formations, almost like swirling letters. Once, I swore I saw the outline of a handprint. Another time, it looked like the shape of a mouth. My heartbeat would spike every time I glanced at it, as though some presence lurked just beneath the floor, struggling to make contact. I started sleeping poorly. Nightmares of walking on a glass bridge over bottomless pits startled me awake. I'd sweat through my sheets, my mouth parched and my pulse raging in my ears. One particular evening, as I sat in the living room, I heard a faint tapping from overhead. My gaze snapped up to the mezzanine. The lights were dim, and the only illumination came from street lamps outside. The tapping continued for a few seconds, then stopped. It sounded like fingernails on glass, the slow and deliberate drumming of someone announcing their presence. My throat constricted, and a flash of panic made my legs tremble. I told myself it was probably just thermal expansion in the metal beams or some creak of the building. Yet my racing heart wouldn't calm, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just above me. Over the next few days, the tension inside me escalated. Whenever I turned out the lights, I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. The air itself felt charged, thick enough to make it difficult to breathe. I noticed that each morning, new bricks would protrude from the wall, forming fresh arrows. Some pointed to buildings I recognized from news articles about skyrocketing property values, while others aligned with unfamiliar windows that, days later, showed up in online listings as prime real estate opportunities. My curiosity twisted into dread. What was this place trying to tell me? My hands trembled each time I opened a newspaper, half expecting to see another clue that matched the brick's direction. I tried to reason with myself. My rational mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe some local real estate developer was rigging this building for a publicity stunt or marketing campaign. Maybe I was simply sleep-deprived, my imagination feeding off the weird architecture. But the feeling wouldn't let go of me, that sense of an intelligence at work, hidden behind bricks and swirling red dust. One Saturday, after another sleepless night, I woke up with a dull ache behind my eyes. The sun was streaming in, and as I climbed the stairs to the mezzanine, I noticed the largest formation of arrows yet. 4 or 5 bricks stuck out in different directions, but formed a convergent path that led around the perimeter of the loft. My chest tightened. Despite my fear, something compelled me to follow them. Each step I took echoed in the silence. I felt beads of cold sweat forming at my temples, and my breath came in ragged bursts. The arrows guided me in a semicircle around the loft until I reached the glass floor. At the exact center of the mezzanine, right where the crack was widest, the final arrow pointed straight down. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint. For a moment I stood there, paralyzed by my own confusion and terror. Then with trembling caution, I stepped onto the glass. I expected it to feel warm beneath my bare feet. The loft was always slightly overheated, but it felt icy, as if I'd placed my foot on a slab of frozen lake. A jolt of panic shot through my body. I almost retreated, but an eerie curiosity tugged at me, commanding me to keep going. The glass groaned under my weight, and I heard a crack deepen. A spiderweb of fractures spread out like a sinister tapestry. My mouth went dry, and I could practically taste adrenaline in the back of my throat. I stood there breathing hard, feeling the tremor in my legs. Then, in a single, jarring instant, the glass gave way. It didn't shatter into large shards like normal tempered glass. Instead, it seemed to dissolve, turning into 1,000 shimmering fragments that floated downward. But instead of falling with them, I felt my stomach lurch as though gravity had flipped. The mezzanine, the walls, the windows, everything shifted upside down in a dizzying, impossible rotation. I hung there in midair, arms flailing, lungs too shocked to scream. The world around me flickered into a black and white haze, like an old film reel. My own body stood below me, staring up, eyes wide with terror. It was as if I were caught between 2 mirrors, able to see my own face from a vantage point that defied all sense. My other self, me, but not me, had the same expression of horror, but it looked more intrigued than frightened, like it was studying me from behind a screen. In that suspended moment, my heartbeat thundered in my ears so loudly that it drowned out all other sound. My skin felt clammy, my breath ragged. The loft around me seemed to ripple and distort, the edges of furniture smearing into the walls. I tried to speak but couldn't make a sound. My throat felt sealed shut. A growing panic cramped every muscle. Then, abruptly, the black and white world vanished, and everything went dark. When I came to, I was lying on a sidewalk a few blocks from the loft, disoriented and nauseous. My vision blurred as I pushed myself upright, heart hammering. A sharp pain shot through my elbows, probably from the fall or from having lain there on the cold concrete for who knows how long. When I stood, the dizziness nearly knocked me back down, and I leaned against a lamppost, gasping for air. People passed by, giving me odd looks but hurrying on. Nobody stopped to help. I reached into my jacket pocket, searching for my phone to call someone, anyone, about what had happened. Instead, my fingers brushed against a sheaf of papers. I pulled them out and felt my blood turn to ice. It was a real estate purchase contract, listing an unfamiliar address. The name on the buyer's line was mine, signed in my own handwriting. But the signature was accompanied by something else. A short phrase below it read, "Verso sub solo," scrawled in jagged letters that were both eerily similar and disturbingly alien to my usual penmanship. My breath caught, and my pulse thumped in my throat. I couldn't recall ever seeing that phrase before, and yet it felt intimately tied to me. For a few minutes, I just stood there, blinking in the harsh morning light. My mind reeled with confusion. How had I ended up here? Why would I sign a contract to purchase some random property? I flipped through the pages. The details were meticulously filled out, referencing local zoning laws, square footage, and partial architectural drawings. Each line of text and every signature space was marked with the same haunting scrawl. I felt a wave of vertigo, as if the street beneath me might tilt and drop me into another inversion of reality. Desperate for answers, I stumbled back toward the loft, ignoring the tightness in my chest and the metallic taste in my mouth. My hands shook the entire way, but when I reached the building, I found the main entrance chained shut with a fresh padlock. No landlord in sight, no maintenance worker. The windows looked dark, the interior unlit. Even the sign that once advertised a loft model for rent was gone, replaced by a blank rusted metal plate. My entire body trembled as I yanked on the chain, calling out for someone to let me in. No reply came. I craned my neck, trying to see if the mezzanine window still showed that damned cracked glass. Nothing was visible but emptiness. A wave of cold fear spread through me. My tongue felt dry and heavy in my mouth. My heart thudded against my ribcage so loudly I feared it would give out. Was the entire loft just a hallucination? Had I dreamed it all? Or maybe stepped into some twisted realm that spat me out after it had taken what it wanted? After a while, I gave up pulling on the lock and staggered away. The contract still clutched in my hand. I felt eyes on me everywhere I went, as though the whole city was now aware of my ordeal. Passing cars sounded too loud. Passing voices seemed to echo strangely, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I found myself checking every reflection in store windows, half expecting to see another version of me staring back with that hollow, analytical gaze. The next few nights were a blur. I didn't dare go back to the building, though I circled the block more than once, hoping to see someone enter or leave. It remained silent and sealed. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that moment of gravity flipping, my own face looking up at me from below, wearing an expression that danced between fascination and malevolence. I'd wake with my heart racing, my body coated in a clammy sweat, the taste of copper on my tongue. Eventually, I reached out to a local real estate office to inquire about the property listed on the contract I supposedly signed. The agent I spoke to, through indirect conversation, since I tried not to let him hear how shaken I was, told me it had been purchased recently, under mysterious conditions. He joked that it was a steal at the price listed, but no one had actually seen the buyer in person. My guts churned. I wondered if that buyer was me, or some version of me. If so, why? I still have the contract in my possession. It sits on my nightstand, an unrelenting reminder of that impossible event. I haven't tried to sign it again. God knows what might happen if I did. Instead, I flip through the pages sometimes, searching for some hidden clue. The red dust never leaves my thoughts. I sometimes catch glimpses of it in my peripheral vision, as though it followed me out of that loft and into my everyday life. Occasionally, in reflective surfaces, I think I see a silhouette just behind me, too tall and too static to be my own. It flickers at the edge of my vision, then vanishes when I turn around. Each day, I struggle with the gnawing question of what truly happened. Did I briefly breach some boundary between realities? Or did the building itself manipulate me to sign a contract that I can't possibly understand? Though no actual harm has come to me physically, no wounds or broken bones, my sense of safety has been permanently fractured. My mind reels at the memory of that inverted world in black and white, the metallic taste of fear in my mouth, and the reflection of my own body staring back at me with unnerving curiosity. Even now, I can't shake the feeling of being watched, monitored by something lurking just beyond my field of vision. The city streets feel more claustrophobic than ever, and every real estate advertisement or construction site triggers a twist of anxiety in my gut. I keep expecting to see more bricks forming arrows in other buildings, or to find fresh references to hidden properties in the local news. My hands still tremble whenever I hold a pen, haunted by the thought that some other version of my signature might appear on documents I've never seen. I don't know whether I escaped or whether the true threat lies ahead. All I'm certain of is the persistent unease that weighs on my chest, the memory of that suspended moment between two realms, and the realization that some part of me, my sub-solo counterpart, might still be walking around in that broken glass mezzanine, gazing up, waiting for another chance to cross over. Story 5. From the moment I stepped back into that empty office on a late Wednesday afternoon, something felt wrong. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their vibrations seeming to penetrate my skull, and the air smelled of stale coffee and damp cardboard. My skin prickled at the nape of my neck, as though invisible fingers were gently tugging at the short hairs. Even before I realized what was happening, I felt an oppressive weight pressing down on me, a sense that something was waiting, watching from the corners where the shadows merged. I stood there, alone, wishing the quiet would ease the tension in my chest. But the quiet was only superficial. Beneath it, I felt a pulsing rhythmic hum, like a muffled heartbeat, or maybe my own heart hammering too hard. That was the moment I knew this was more than just workplace stress. Something had followed me here, something that should never have been invited in. I had started the prank innocently enough. Initially, it was just a joke between me and a friend in the IT department, a small Bluetooth speaker hidden away in the supply closet. I had recorded a distorted voice that would hiss, "You made a mistake," whenever someone opened the door. The idea was to give my colleagues a momentary jolt of surprise. Everyone in our office was burned out from countless deadlines and last-minute demands, so a bit of levity seemed welcome. When I first tested it, the reaction was exactly as I had hoped. Startled gasps, nervous laughter, a handful of curses. People would tease each other about who triggered the voice and move on. It should have ended there. After a few days, the joke started wearing thin. I remember noticing a few coworkers, usually the more anxious ones, lingering outside the closet, unsure if they should even open it. I began feeling guilty about making people uneasy, so I decided to remove the device. It was a short-lived prank, and I never intended to cause lasting trouble. One evening after nearly everyone had gone home, I retrieved the speaker from its hiding spot among the dusty reams of paper and half-empty stapler boxes. Yet, to my surprise, the voice continued. At first, I thought maybe the speaker was still there, and I had grabbed a different device by mistake, but I had only ever purchased one. I turned the closet upside down, rummaging through every shelf, and found nothing else. The speaker was in my hand, deactivated and disconnected, yet the same synthetic monotone insisted, "You made a mistake," from somewhere behind the stacks of supplies. That was strange enough, but it got far worse. Over the next week, the voice changed. It no longer repeated the same line. Coworkers began whispering in the break room that whenever they went to fetch something from the closet, they heard bizarre statements rattling off details about the company's confidential files. One woman confided in me that she heard the voice recite something akin to a list of internal budgets that were supposed to be top secret. Others claimed it recited future product codes or the personal data of employees. No one could comprehend how the closet might be leaking this information. Worse yet, whoever listened to the voice too long would enter a sort of trance, afterwards scribbling on any available sheet of paper. Someone pinned one of these frantic sketches to a corkboard, and it displayed a labyrinthine organogram with scribbled lines connecting names of staff, the CEO, and random departments. Certain names were savagely crossed out, the ink pressed so hard it tore the paper. My initial reaction was to laugh it off as an elaborate rumor, but part of me suspected something was actually happening. More and more employees complained of hearing an entity in the closet that extended beyond my original recording. They mentioned how each time it spoke, the words sounded more precise, less robotic, like an AI that was learning too quickly. Nobody connected it to my harmless prank. Why would they? I tried to keep my involvement secret, yet I felt a creeping sense of responsibility. I was the one who'd planted the seed. I blamed myself for opening some door that I had no right to unlock. Finally, curiosity overpowered my fear. Late one evening, I decided to investigate, staying behind when the last coworker left. The corridors were eerily still, illuminated by emergency lights that cast elongated shadows on the floor. My footsteps echoed as though someone were walking just behind me. My stomach churned with equal parts fear and determination. When I reached the closet, I paused, listening for any sign of that voice. At first, there was only the hum of the ventilation system. Then, as I gently pressed my ear to the door, I heard it. Whispers, synthetic yet strangely alive, enumerating something about departmental cutbacks, reciting bullet points from future board meetings. The monotone rose and fell, gaining an unnatural rhythm that made my heartbeat pound in my ears. I steeled myself and swung open the door. The closet was dark, just as I expected. The sensation of stepping into that cramped, musty space still makes my throat go dry. My flashlight swept over piles of sticky notes, rolls of shipping tape, and battered cardboard boxes. Nothing seemed out of place, no hidden devices or secret wires. But the voice continued anyway, reverberating from every corner, echoing as though the walls themselves were speaking. My pulse quickened, and I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. Determined to find the source, I went deeper, pushing aside a leaning tower of old binders. Then I stopped cold, because the voice had mentioned my name. It was rattling off some alleged infractions I had committed against the company, referencing timesheets I'd never touched and project logs I'd never falsified. My mouth went bone dry. I realized, with growing dread, that the words it spoke pointed to a version of me that did not yet exist, enumerating transgressions I had not, and hoped I would never, commit. Shaken, I hurried out and closed the door behind me. My head throbbed, and my heart pounded so violently that I could hardly focus. I knew I couldn't ignore this any longer. I decided to tear that closet apart, find whatever was inside, and destroy it. If it was some twisted security device or leftover hardware from a failed marketing gimmick, I would dismantle it on the spot. What I discovered was beyond my worst nightmares. The very next day, before anyone else arrived, I removed the closet's shelves and started prying loose the thin plywood backing. The lighting flickered overhead, intensifying my sense of anxiety. Each hammer strike against the nails reverberated too loudly, making me feel as though I was attracting the attention of something intangible lurking in the corners of the office. My hands were clammy, and my teeth clenched so tightly that my jaw ached. Eventually, the backing broke free, and behind it, I found a mass of tangled wires threaded through what looked like organic matter. My stomach lurched. I inched closer, holding my breath to keep from gagging. There were small fragments of what I recognized after a horrifying moment, as human teeth fastened together with nylon threads. Each tooth was carefully embedded at the tip of a wire, forming some bizarre microphone array. The nauseating stench of old copper and something faintly rotten washed over me. A wave of revulsion crashed through my gut. My skin crawled as I thought about whose teeth these could be, and how they ended up here. Still, I braced myself and began yanking wires loose. I wanted these monstrosities gone. But the moment I tugged on the first piece, the voice started again, except this time it was my own voice. It spoke from all around, listing out labor infractions that sounded terrifyingly plausible, as if foretelling what I might do if pushed to the brink. Misreporting hours, sabotaging coworker files, leaking proprietary secrets. Each accusation weighed on me like a brand across my conscience, fueling my panic. I dropped the wire in a frenzy and stumbled backward. My chest tightened, and my vision blurred around the edges. It felt as though I was losing my grip on reality right there in that cramped, debris-filled space. For a full minute, I couldn't move. My hands trembled so intensely that I couldn't even pick up the tools. The disembodied version of my own voice continued to echo through the office, giving form to fears I had never acknowledged. Eventually, the reverberations died down, leaving only my ragged breathing and the whispering hum of distant computers. My heart drummed against my ribcage, and sweat rolled down my face, stinging my eyes. I forced myself to stand, but my knees wobbled like they might give out at any second. After that, I sealed the closet door with tape, vowing not to open it again, but my desperate efforts offered no relief. Every night, well past midnight, the entire row of desks vibrated gently, as though the floor itself had begun to shiver. I'd hear it from my cubicle when I worked late, a persistent, low-pitched resonance, like a pulse traveling through the building's support beams. Then a collective chant would rise from the furniture, repeating something ominous. Promote us, or we promote your silence. The first time I heard it, I slammed my hands over my ears, nearly hyperventilating. I doubted my own senses. Perhaps the stress was causing auditory hallucinations. But the next day, a coworker confided they had heard something too. A droning threat that kept them awake, an insistence that demanded more power or else. Our break room chatter transformed into hushed confessions of nightmarish experiences, and yet nobody truly believed their own words. We were rational modern employees in a typical corporate environment. Why would a desk, or a closet, or anything inanimate speak at all? Sporadically, coworkers discovered that the whiteboard in our main conference room had changed. Diagrams that were drawn for project planning took on sinister shapes overnight. Org charts would warp into swirling lines. Entire departments would be circled in thick black marker, with individuals singled out, their names violently crossed out or replaced by question marks. No one claimed responsibility, and our security cameras never caught any suspect entering the room after hours. Many suspected an elaborate break-in or a twisted inside joke, but people were too disturbed to investigate properly. By then, I was barely sleeping. My nights were fraught with nightmares in which I heard my own voice scolding me for sins I hadn't committed. My appetite vanished, my stomach knotted each time I tried to eat. In the mornings, I woke drenched in sweat, an uncomfortable film clinging to my skin, my pulse racing before I even opened my eyes. One evening, I stayed awake in the office, determined to confront whatever was behind this. Just after midnight, the lights flickered, and a faint humming rose beneath my chair. My entire cubicle vibrated, not violently, but just enough to make my legs tremble. The overhead lamps dimmed, and the chant started. Promote us, or we promote your silence. The words weren't coming from a single source. They seemed to surround me, pressing in on my ears, reverberating from every desk drawer, every swivel chair, every partition. A wave of claustrophobia hit me. My chest constricted so tightly I thought I might faint. Trying to calm myself, I focused on breathing steadily. My heart rattled in my rib cage like it wanted to escape. Fear pinned me to my seat, but determination forced me to stand. I gripped the edge of my desk for support. I could feel the vibrations coursing through the metal frame, like a current of static electricity. Something primal in me whispered that if I ran now, this would never end. So I forced my feet to carry me toward the closet, even as every cell in my body screamed to turn back. The seal I'd placed over the door was peeled away, as though someone had carefully removed the tape. The door stood ajar, beckoning me with a stale draft that smelled of corroded metal and old cardboard. My heart pounded so fiercely I thought it might crack my sternum. There was a tingling at the base of my skull, a primal alarm telling me I was about to see something I shouldn't. Summoning all my courage, I swung the door open. The teeth-laden wires were still there, forming a grotesque nest behind the broken panel. Their exposed ends bristled, swaying as though something had breathed on them. For a moment, I thought I saw them glow in the dim overhead light. Or perhaps that was my eyes playing tricks. I swallowed the bile, threatening to rise in my throat, and forced myself to focus. The voice began again, enumerating ways the company could sabotage me if I ever divulged corporate secrets, tactics that aligned with real-world legal clauses, but laced with an edge of malevolence. The closet walls felt like they were pressing in, as if the entire space was inhaling around me. My own fear radiated outward, turning my limbs weak. Some primal survival instinct told me to make one final push, to rip out every last wire, teeth and all, and end this once and for all. I grabbed the biggest pair of pliers I had and latched onto the cluster of wires. The second I pulled, the voice shrieked, then warbled into a series of frantic echoes. My heart lurched, but I didn't stop. Each yank produced a series of pops and snaps, as though I was tearing ligaments from bone, which made my skin crawl with revulsion. Bit by bit, the nest came loose, leaving behind an empty cavity in the drywall. When I finally tore the last filament away, the lights flickered overhead, and the building fell silent. My ears rang in the absence of that droning chant. My breathing came in ragged bursts, and I realized my cheeks were damp with tears of frustration and fear. Holding the severed wires, I stood there in that battered closet, feeling a precarious sense of triumph. I wanted to think it was over, that the abomination had been destroyed, yet the next few nights proved that my victory was incomplete. Though the voice no longer emanated from the closet, the rest of the furniture still quivered in the darkness. The identical demand rose each evening, albeit quieter than before. Promote us, or we promote your silence. Even the whiteboard diagrams continued to shift. I found them altered each morning. More names, more lines, more uncertain connections. It was as if the entire office had become a living organism, each piece of furniture a cell in a malevolent network. My sense of dread bloomed with every passing hour, a tangible heaviness in my chest that kept me wide awake at night. Feeling I had no other choice, I finally decided to reveal my prank to management, hoping that coming clean might shed some rational light on the situation. In a closed-door meeting, I explained the entire story, minus the supernatural horrors. I spoke in measured tones about the speaker I had hidden, acknowledging my lapse in judgment but avoiding the bizarre details that might call my sanity into question. The manager listened stone-faced, taking meticulous notes but saying little. I left that meeting more uneasy than before, convinced that my confession might make me a target if the voice in the building demanded scapegoats. As days became weeks, the atmosphere in the office grew more oppressive. Coworkers were always on edge, avoiding the supply closet and the conference room, as though stepping inside might curse them. Fear etched itself into every face, and simple tasks like retrieving a stack of paper turned into anxiety-ridden ordeals. My own paranoia skyrocketed. I started to imagine eyes peering at me from every reflective surface. The hum of computers morphed into droning murmurs that almost resembled my name. My reflection in the hallway mirrors looked gaunter, as if each day was draining the life out of me. Eventually, I reached a point where the illusions, if they were illusions, became too much to bear. One evening, I confronted the presence out loud, half certain I was talking to myself. I demanded that it leave, that it cease haunting the building and exposing private data. I insisted there was no reason to continue, that the prank was over, and everyone wanted to forget. Silence followed, thick and claustrophobic. For a moment, I believed the phenomenon had ended. But just then, the corners of the office seemed to darken, and the faintest whisper tickled my ear, though I can't say for sure if it was real or my own imagination. I realized then that the cost of opening this door, whatever it truly was, couldn't be erased so easily. This presence had latched onto the insecurities, the hidden ambitions, and the paranoid corporate culture thriving in our workplace. It found nourishment in the secrets we kept, in the petty rivalries that never saw the light of day. Tearing out the bizarre hardware was only half the battle. The intangible seed had already rooted itself in the environment, feeding on the tension of deadlines and the fear of being found out. In the end, I had no choice but to escape. I handed in my resignation, claiming personal reasons. On my last night, I felt the vibrations under my desk again. The chairs shuddered. The overhead lights flickered. The chant rose one final time, echoing in the stillness. Promote us, or we promote your silence. But the building no longer felt like a place of potential promotion or career advancement. It felt like an eldritch temple devoted to some intangible hunger. I gathered my things and rushed for the door. Although the hallway was vacant, I sensed shapes in the corners of my vision. My breath rattled in my throat and I fought the urge to sprint. Now, each day that passes, I wrestle with the memory of those nights and that mocking, relentless voice. In my dreams, I still see those horrifying, tooth-wired microphones. I worry that I've carried a fragment of that presence with me, lurking in the recesses of my subconscious. Sometimes late at night, I almost hear the furniture in my new apartment quiver and hum in unison, as though testing the resonance of the walls. I jolt awake, heart racing, damp with sweat, convinced that the words will soon return. And I wonder if I truly left that terror behind, or if it found a way to follow me, waiting for the perfect moment to speak again. Story 6. Darkness clung to my living room like a damp shroud. The dim glow from a single floor lamp cast skewed shadows against the walls, creating shapes that seemed to bend and writhe in the corner of my eyes. Though the evening was silent, I felt an incessant pressure in my chest, as if the air itself were saturated with an unspoken warning. There was something undeniably off in the atmosphere, a prickling static that made every hair on my arms stand on end. My eyes kept drifting toward the mantelpiece, drawn by an inexplicable magnetism to the Victorian bust perched there like a silent sentinel. Even in the low light, its blank porcelain gaze seemed to fasten itself on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just decor, that something in it was listening or judging. I live alone in a small suburban house, well-maintained and relatively modern except for the living room's fireplace. The stone hearth and the elaborate mantel were already in place when I moved in, along with the bust. In fact, I inherited the bust from the previous owner, who insisted it was a family heirloom and part of the ambiance that gave the home its unique charm. At first, I wasn't even sure if I liked it. The pallid face and rigid posture were unnerving, but I convinced myself that it was a quirky decorative piece worth keeping. Besides, removing it felt like it would disrupt some strange balance in the house, a notion I couldn't logically explain. Over time, I stopped questioning why I kept it. I simply let it be, though I remember occasionally wishing it would just vanish. My job requires me to stay updated on current events, and I have a habit of leaving the TV on even when I'm not actively watching. One unsettling quirk I noticed almost immediately. Whenever a sensational headline came on, especially something that was later debunked or proven exaggerated, the bust would seem to shift. At first, it was so slight that I attributed it to my imagination. I'd turn my head for a moment, and when I looked back, its angle was off by a few degrees. The first couple of times I laughed at myself, figuring I was just jumpy, but then I began to pay closer attention. Every false rumor, every doctored news story, every glaring piece of misinformation that crawled across the screen seemed to correspond with a distinct, deliberate rotation of the bust's neck, 15 degrees if I had to guess. The first night this happened, I felt my stomach clench, as if someone had punched me in the gut. The newscaster on TV, whose face was plastered with an unnaturally broad grin, appeared to freeze in mid-speech. His lips flickered, then reappeared stitched together in a hideous digital glitch. The screen locked on that distorted image for a few seconds before snapping back to normal. My heart thundered in my ears. I tried changing the channel, but nothing happened. The TV refused to respond, stuck on the broadcast with that unnerving smile. Then the channel jumped on its own to a commercial break, and everything looked fine again, the newscaster chatting casually about the next segment. Although the entire incident lasted maybe 20 seconds, it left me reeling. The bust behind me remained angled at that fresh 15-degree turn, as if it had followed the falsity on screen and responded in its own silent condemnation. I began to dread the moment I sensed another sensational or obviously misleading headline. My breath would catch, my palms would sweat, and I'd stare at the bust from the corner of my eye, anticipating its next move. Sure enough, each time an outright lie aired, the porcelain figure would rotate another 15 degrees with an almost mechanical precision. I could hardly believe my own observations. The tension in my living room became suffocating. My throat would dry out, and my mind raced with irrational thoughts. Was the statue punishing me somehow? Was I responsible for the lies spouted on television simply because I was present and allowing them to fill the air? No matter how ridiculous it seemed, I couldn't quell the creeping suspicion that the bust was sentient, that it recognized the falsehoods and reacted with something akin to moral outrage. The worst part was that the newscaster's visage would often flicker into that horrifying grin with digitally sewn lips whenever the bust moved. The glitch never lasted long. but it was as if the TV was also in on some cosmic joke. After a while, I couldn't decide if the newscaster was smiling at me or at the bust. My logical side insisted this was all impossible. Maybe the TV was malfunctioning. Perhaps the bust was slightly loose on the mantel, shifting due to floor vibrations or air currents. Still, those rationalizations felt hollow when I felt the cold weight of dread gnawing at my spine. This unnerving cycle repeated itself for weeks. Each small lie on the news tugged the bust's posture a little more. 15 degrees here, 15 there. I began to keep track in a little notebook, noting the angle and the type of story. The angles added up: 45, 90, 180 degrees. Each time the face turned, the mechanical nature of the movement made my heart hammer in my chest. My breath grew quick, and my vision sometimes blurred with anxiety. I tried changing my viewing habits, switching off the TV whenever questionable stories aired, but it made no difference. If even a sliver of the story was fake, the bust twitched. My nights were filled with restless tossing, haunted by half-dreams of cracking porcelain and taunting newscasters. Then came the night it turned a full 360 degrees. I had been up late, mindlessly cycling through channels, tension thrumming through my neck and shoulders. The newscaster on my usual station began another segment, and I immediately recognized the sensational tone. Sure enough, the bust started its slow, methodical movement. My pulse pounded in my ears. In that instant, time seemed to drag out, each second dripping like molasses. The bust's head completed its usual 15-degree increments, but it didn't stop at 180. It kept rotating, joints letting out a faint grinding sound as if protesting this final revolution. When it hit the full 360 degrees, something snapped. It was an audible crack, like bones breaking under pressure. My lungs clenched and I nearly choked on my own breath, coughing in a panic. A wave of nausea hit me so hard I had to steady myself against the back of the couch. At the same moment, the TV's picture froze. The newscaster's lips parted into a hideous grin, but the stitches were still there, crawling across his mouth in an inconsistent digital mess. Then, in a flicker, his expression changed. Still smiling, but now he was pointing forward as if targeting me specifically. My stomach dropped. My scalp prickled with sweat. He repeated a single word in a loop. You. The voice was mechanical, emotionless, and it reverberated in my skull like an echo in a cavern. My breathing grew ragged, and the hair on my arms stood rigid. I fumbled for the remote, desperate to end that dreadful mantra. I stabbed the power button. The TV screen went dark, the voice vanished, and I was left in suffocating silence. But the relief was brief. In the reflection of the now blank screen, I could see the bust behind me. My knees almost buckled when I realized its neck was still turned, but not toward the TV anymore. It was staring directly at me, its head fully reversed from its original forward-facing position. Worse, its chest appeared to be splitting open. The porcelain cracked and parted like a fragile rib cage, revealing an interior far larger than the sculpture's size should allow. My vision blurred at the edges, and I could taste fear like metal in the back of my throat. I felt my pulse hammering in my temples, each beat a sickening throb that threatened to overwhelm my senses. Inside the bust's opened torso, I saw a tiny television flickering. The screen was murky at first, static dancing across it in waves. Then it cleared, revealing what appeared to be me, sound asleep, twisted in bed with my neck at the same unnatural angle the bust had just performed. My mind raced. Was this some sort of hallucination? I felt a jolt of panic so profound that my entire body trembled. My breath came in short, erratic gasps. My legs turned to jelly, and I had to grip the armrest to keep from collapsing. I couldn't find the courage to approach the bust. My own reflection in the black TV screen showed me just how pale and wild-eyed I looked. My heart hammered so loudly I feared it might burst. I thought about calling someone, a friend or even emergency services, to explain that there was something terribly wrong happening in my home. But what could I possibly say? That my Victorian bust rotated on its own and displayed a mini TV inside its chest? broadcasting a sickening image of me lying with a twisted neck. The entire notion was too deranged to utter aloud, so I just stood there, rooted in place by a terror that seemed to anchor my feet to the floor. Eventually, I forced myself to move. My body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, every limb sluggish and laden with dread. I quietly made my way around the couch, never taking my eyes off that reflection in the TV screen. The bust's chest remained open, porcelain edges fractured and jutting out like claws. A cold sweat soaked my shirt. I caught a whiff of something akin to scorched electronics, a sharp odor that made my nostrils flare in disgust. It was as if the tiny TV inside the bust was broadcasting a nightmare I had yet to experience, or maybe one I'd already lived. Fighting the nausea, I stepped closer. I tried to reason with myself that if I could just prove this was some elaborate illusion, I'd regain control. So I leaned in, ignoring the frantic drum of my pulse. The flickering image of me on that little screen was disturbingly detailed. I watched the rise and fall of my chest as I slept, my face twitching as if locked in a bad dream. My neck was twisted at a horrifying angle, the same 360-degree turn that the bust had performed. Yet there was no sign of injury, just an impossible angle. My mouth was slightly open, eyes fluttering beneath the lids. I felt my vision blur with tears, the dryness in my mouth intensifying. My own body was betraying me, reacting to a horror that I couldn't rationalize away. I remember thinking, this can't be real. I must be asleep on that very couch, experiencing some brutal nightmare. Even so, everything felt hyper-real. The dryness of my lips, the slick sweat on my palms, the faint hum of the television set cooling down after I'd turned it off. The bust remained horrifyingly still, its chest pried open in macabre display. The longer I stared, the more convinced I became that something beyond my comprehension had taken root in my house. Perhaps it had always been here, waiting. In a desperate attempt to break the spell, I reached for the bust. The moment my fingertips brushed the cold porcelain, a jolt of static electricity jumped between us. I jerked back, heart pounding harder than ever. The bust shifted slightly, and for a moment I thought it was going to rotate again. My breath caught in my throat. My entire body tensed as I prepared to run. But it remained in place, chest ajar, that tiny screen continuing its broadcast of my twisted figure in restful torment. I staggered back, my mind reeling. I thought about smashing it, grabbing a hammer from the garage and pounding the porcelain into dust until that obscene little TV was nothing but shards. But the mere idea of picking up a hammer, crossing that living room again, and launching an assault against something that seemed alive sent a surge of dread through me. My body shook and my hands felt clammy. I forced myself to breathe slowly, but my lungs felt restricted, as if my ribcage was tightening in solidarity with that horrifying sculpture. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the living room, knees pulled to my chest, back pressed against the cool wall. I could see the fireplace from that vantage point, though the shadows were thick enough to obscure some details. The bust loomed in partial darkness, still open, still containing that flickering screen. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the small sounds of the house. The distant hum of the refrigerator, the faint creaking of the wooden beams as the temperature dropped. Yet every so often, I would hear a subtle click or scrape from the mantel, as if the bust was shifting its porcelain pieces in the dark. By the time morning light seeped through the curtains, I felt delirious with exhaustion and fear. The bust was once again closed, its chest appearing untouched. There was no sign of the little TV inside it, but I could still smell that faint odor of scorched electronics. My reflection in the dark television set was no longer visible, replaced by a normal morning news show that had begun automatically. Gathering what little courage I had left, I reached for the remote and turned the TV off. The living room fell silent. In that hush, I dared to take a step closer to the mantel. The bust looked as it always did, a stern Victorian face, its posture dignified, the porcelain surface pristine. If it weren't for the log of times and angles I'd kept, I might have thought it was all a vivid hallucination. Yet my body wouldn't let me dismiss the terror. My muscles ached from tension. and I couldn't ignore the deep-seated conviction that I was no longer safe in my own home. I wondered if I ever had been. An unshakable sense of being watched clung to me, even in the bright light of morning. Every creak in the floorboards felt like a footstep behind me. Every rustle of fabric sounded like a soft hiss in my ear. My paranoia escalated to the point where I questioned my reflection in every reflective surface. Mirrors, windows, the turned-off TV screen. Was I still me? Or had something changed irreversibly in that moment when the bust revealed its hidden screen? Ultimately, I decided I couldn't stay in that living room. I gathered some belongings, threw them into a bag, and headed for the door, trying not to look at the mantel as I passed. I didn't plan to be gone forever, but I needed space and clarity. I needed to prove to myself that the twisted vision in the bust's chest wasn't a premonition of some inevitable fate. My hand shook on the doorknob, and my breath caught in my throat when I felt the faintest brush of cold air on my neck, almost like an exhalation from the bust itself. I forced the door open, stepped into the daylight, and slammed it shut behind me. I don't know if I'll return. Part of me believes that if I leave the house long enough, the bust will revert to being an inanimate piece of Victorian kitsch. Maybe someone will question me about strange events, or maybe I'll question my own sanity long enough that I'll decide none of it was real. But there's a corner of my mind that knows the truth. Something in that bust is alive, responding to the falsehoods of the world, and waiting for the moment to reveal the final lie that breaks us all. Each time I feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, I wonder if it's calling me back, if it's turning another 15 degrees in my absence, broadcasting a new horror just beneath its porcelain skin. For now, I cling to the uneasy relief of distance, but even here, away from the mantel and the flickering TV, I can't escape the incessant feeling that I'm still being observed. Every reflection seems like it could warp at any second, showing me twisted images of myself, dissected and rearranged by that porcelain monstrosity. My fear thrives in the possibility that I've carried the terror with me, that the same presence is anchored to my consciousness rather than just the living room. I haven't slept properly since that night. Whenever I drift off, I jolt awake from nightmares of rotating necks and glitching newscasters pointing straight at me. My only consolation, if it can be called that, is that I survived the encounter. No one died, but survival doesn't always mean escape. Sometimes it just means living with the knowledge that out there, or perhaps within, you've invited a darkness that can never really be sealed away. And so I wait, suspended between terror and the faint hope that I will regain my sanity. I wait, haunted by the memory of the bust's neck snapping into a full circle, the presenter's sewn-lipped grin, and the miniature TV showing my own unconscious form locked in an impossible twist. Even away from the mantel, I can almost hear the newscaster's voice rasping in the back of my mind, trapped in that infernal loop. You. And every time I recall it, my heart flutters with that same electric dread, as if warning me that the next turn of the bust's head might be my final glimpse into a reality I'm no longer sure I want to understand. Story 7. From the very first moment I stepped into that narrow hallway, I felt something was off. The air smelled stale, as though it had been holding its breath for decades. The overhead bulb flickered weakly, casting thin shadows against the peeling wallpaper. Somehow I knew that by crossing the threshold, I had set into motion events I could never fully understand. There was a quiet sense of anticipation, like the house itself was waiting for me to discover something it had carefully hidden. A prickle of tension crawled across the back of my neck, and a near imperceptible pressure wrapped around my lungs. I still remember how my heart thudded in my chest, how my mouth went dry, and how my palms turned clammy before I even laid a finger on the dusty windows I'd come to polish. I'm not a professional restorer, just an enthusiast who enjoys tinkering with old houses and salvaging antique fittings. I make ends meet by buying neglected properties, cleaning them up and reselling them. When I took on the job of renovating this crumbling townhouse, I felt like I'd snagged an incredible deal. From the outside, it looked run down and unimpressive. with rotted siding and a sagging front porch. But beneath its decay, there was a timeless elegance: stained glass panels above each door frame, intricate wrought iron railings, and massive, towering windows, vitros, framed in bronze. I was particularly fascinated by those windows, convinced they could be polished back to their original luster. The first few days were uneventful. I spent hours scraping old paint off the walls, listening to the rhythmic grind of my tools, lulled into a false sense of comfort by the monotony of renovation work. I slept on a fold-out cot in one of the smaller rooms near the entryway, waking to dusty sunlight each morning. The house was eerily quiet, even when the wind blew through gaps in the window frames at night. Sometimes I imagined I heard faint creaking in the hall, like soft footsteps just beyond the door, but I'd tell myself it was the old wood settling. Eventually, I got to the real task: polishing those tall vitros. They were thick with grime, making it hard to see anything but murky shapes through the glass. I remember the day I finally assembled all my supplies: rags, brushes, and a pungent cleaning solution that promised to remove decades of residue. The chemical scent stung my nostrils, and I felt a faint burning in the back of my throat. Standing in front of the first window, I carefully unscrewed the top of the cleaner. My palms had already begun to sweat again. My heart gave a nervous flutter as I sprayed the milky liquid across the pane. I recall the squeak of the damp rag against the glass, how it left an oily sheen that slowly disappeared. A sense of accomplishment flickered in me when the first portion of glass sparkled, revealing the corridor outside. But I also felt as if something was looking back at me from the other side. Each time I paused to check my progress, I caught my own reflection, pale, grim-faced, with dark smudges under my eyes. The reflection behind mine, though, appeared a fraction of a second late, as if the glass were slow to catch up. I dismissed it as a trick of old glass. Still, a tension built between my shoulder blades, and I had to keep wiping sweat from my brow. The deeper I got into the cleaning, the more oppressive the odor of ammonia became. It clung to my clothes, burned my eyes, and settled at the back of my tongue. I tried to push through it. Eventually, the hallway lights were just too dim. The old bulb above me crackled periodically, casting shadows that seemed to twist in unexpected directions. I felt a faint vibration each time the bulb sizzled, and it made my teeth ache. The longer I stood there, the more the notion that I wasn't truly alone crept into my mind. I felt prickles on the back of my neck, as though I were being silently observed. Then it happened. The light exploded in a brief, blinding flash. I had just turned around to reach for a fresh rag when I heard a sharp pop. Glass shards shattered outwards. My ears rang. I stumbled back, and something blasted me against the door with jarring force. The collision rattled my bones and took the wind out of me. My vision doubled. For a moment, I saw two distorted hallways merging into one. Slowly, I steadied myself against the door, ears still buzzing and heart hammering like a jackhammer. Amid the confusion, I spotted something impossible on the walls: my silhouette. More precisely, 4 silhouettes. Each was projected on a different wall, fully outlined in inky black. They looked like motionless duplicates of me, cast by some unholy light source that no longer existed. My breath caught in my throat. Every muscle in my body seized. Instinctively, I raised my arm. But my shadows didn't move in perfect unison. They responded with a short delay, 2 seconds behind each one of my gestures. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shattered bulb. Perhaps my blurred vision was causing me to see multiple shadows. But they weren't ordinary shadows. They were more defined than any shadow I had ever seen, as though they had presence. Each one began to mimic the motion of cleaning the windows, despite there being no glass there at all. Their movements were synchronized to each other but lagged behind mine. When I braced myself against the door, they continued to scrub, swiping the air with rags that didn't exist in their hands. I felt a mild stinging on my upper arm and realized a piece of glass was embedded there. The sting was accompanied by the warm trickle of blood. My chest heaved with shallow, rapid breaths, and my vision blurred at the edges. Yet I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadows. The air tasted like ammonia, heavy and toxic, and each breath felt like I was inhaling pure fumes. I attempted to stand up straight to calm down, but my body trembled with fear, sweat drenching the back of my neck. My heart pounded so loudly I could feel the pulse in my temples. Cautiously, I lifted my right arm again and watched as the four silhouettes repeated the gesture a few seconds later. I moved my hand in a slow, trembling wave. The silhouettes complied, each out of sync with my real body by the same eerie interval. But when I froze in place, they kept going, rubbing invisible glass as if in frenzied servitude to some residue I couldn't see. The friction was audible, an escalating squeak that intensified until it sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I felt a cold sweat slick my forehead, and the hair on my arms stood up. I smelled something burning, and realized that the air itself seemed to be heating wherever the shadows rubbed. My lungs constricted at the acrid smell of heated ammonia that filled the hallway. I wanted to flee. I took a few tentative steps toward the door at the far end of the corridor. My hands shook uncontrollably, and my breath came in quick, ragged gasps. Yet as I tried to push past one wall, I discovered the wallpaper folding over itself, as if being crumpled from within. The movement was deliberate, inhuman. The paper bunched and bent in angles resembling wrinkled aluminum foil. The silhouette there pinned the folds in place, blocking my exit. When I pressed my hand against it, expecting old plaster, I felt something cold and slick like living flesh. I jerked back so fast that pain shot through my wrist. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. The sense of claustrophobia grew. The house itself was constricting around me. A vicious trembling overtook me as I turned to the opposite side, hoping to duck through the next door. I could see the hallway's end, but the second shadow repeated the same closing gesture, doubling the wallpaper over on itself. Each of the four silhouettes sealed off every route I attempted. My teeth chattered from a bizarre mix of terror and an unnerving cold that seemed to radiate from the walls. With nowhere else to go, I sank to my knees, brushing away tears I hadn't realized were streaming down my face. My breathing was ragged, and my mouth felt so dry that swallowing became difficult. I was convinced I'd lost my mind. No one else had come in or out of this house for days. If I screamed for help, I doubted anyone would hear me through the boarded-up windows and thick layers of dust. Still, a muffled voice in my head told me to keep calm. Eventually, the shadows stuttered to a halt, as if whatever force animated them had paused to observe me. They loomed, standing in rows, waiting. I can't say how long I knelt there, eyes locked on those four silhouettes. My thoughts whirled, and that constant ammonia stench curdled in my sinuses. Time felt meaningless, compressed and distorted by sheer panic. At last, I found the courage to stand again, ignoring the throbbing pain in my arm and the shallow bleeding. I moved carefully toward the exit. The silhouettes flickered like stuttering film frames, then resumed their frantic cleaning motions. Steam or smoke rose from the places they scrubbed. The walls blistered as if scorched from the inside. I forced myself to push forward, half expecting the horrifying flesh-like wallpaper to grab me again. But this time, I managed to slip past. I don't recall how I actually got the door open. I only remember stumbling onto the front porch, nearly tripping over the rotted boards, and collapsing onto the street. I must have passed out. When I awoke, pale sunlight was creeping across my face. The memory of what had happened still glowed like a fever dream in my mind. I prayed that it had been nothing but a product of my exhausted imagination. But the bandage on my arm and the stinging cut told me otherwise. I sat up, wincing at a wave of nausea, and realized my right palm throbbed with a pinprick of pain. There, in the center of my lifeline, a narrow wound had opened from the inside out, as if something had forced its way out. I was too scared to peel back the dried blood and look closer. Telling myself I needed proof, I returned to the corridor once dawn fully broke. I moved tentatively, calling out in a shaky voice to see if any echo returned. The hallway was quiet, bathed in the glow of a fresh morning. Broken glass from the exploded bulb crunched under my boots. And then I saw it. The vitro I had cleaned was immaculate, shining as though it were brand new. No leftover grime, not a single smudge. My mouth went dry again. My hands trembled at the thought that something, or someone, had continued my work overnight. Against my better judgment, I searched the walls for any sign of my shadows. They were gone. No sign of them. No dark outlines. Nothing. But the wallpaper bore oddly warped folds and creases, like it had been pressed and smoothed back out. The entire house smelled like faint ammonia, as if the air itself had been scoured. My stomach clenched. My nerves fluttered with dread and relief in equal measure. My rational mind tried to insist that I must have hallucinated the whole incident, but the memory of those silhouettes, delayed by 2 seconds, clung to me. Now each morning when I walk into that corridor, I'm greeted by impeccable windows. They gleam under any light source available, free of dust or streaks. I have no recollection of polishing them, yet the strong odor of cleaning chemicals follows me everywhere. My clothes reek of ammonia. My hands sting when water touches them, and the cut in the center of my right palm bleeds in a fine, perfectly straight line. Even bandages never stay clean. They become soaked with a slow trickle of blood that seeps out overnight. By noon each day, the bleeding seems to close, only to open again the next morning. Sometimes I feel a presence over my shoulder, especially when I stand near a reflective surface. I catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, as though shadows are cleaning beside me. They echo my gestures, trailing behind as if caught in a temporal lag. My pulse quickens each time it happens. My breath hitches, and a wave of clammy heat passes over my entire body. I've grown wary of my own reflection, dreading what I might see if I stare too long. The worst part is, I can't tell if these impressions are only in my head. I haven't abandoned the townhouse yet, though every fiber of my being screams for me to do so. I want to believe I can fix this place, restore it, and move on. But each day I stay, the house worms deeper under my skin, and I can't escape the queasy sensation that my shadow isn't fully my own anymore. Even outside, in broad daylight, I sometimes notice a slight lag in my reflection in shop windows, as if it wants to clean instead of simply mirror me. At night, when I close my eyes, I sense the phantom scrubbing. The smell of boiling ammonia seeps into my dreams, filling them with sizzling static and muffled scrapes of cloth. Sometimes I startle awake, certain that I hear repetitive wiping sounds echoing in the corridor. My heart races, and my mouth is so dry I can barely swallow. In those moments, I feel compelled to go back to the hallway, to watch those silhouettes polish their invisible glass, but I resist, terrified of acknowledging that they might still exist beyond the edges of my vision, waiting to creep back into my reality if I give them the slightest invitation. I live in a state of hypervigilance, constantly glancing over my shoulder. My neck is stiff from tension, my body perpetually on high alert. Every squeak in the floorboards makes me jump. I barely eat. My hands shake so much that I drop utensils. Drinking water has become an ordeal. If it slips from my mouth or trickles down my chin, the pungent aftertaste of ammonia sometimes flares up from the back of my throat. It's enough to choke me. Yet despite the dread that coils in my stomach, I'm compelled to keep cleaning. Each morning I find my supplies in the corridor. The rags are laid out, the bottles of cleaner lined up as though carefully placed by unseen hands. The windows, of course, need no further polishing, but I still sense an expectation, an unspoken demand that I maintain the house's bizarre perfection. My wound itches whenever I resist, the pain radiating until I relent. I wish I could offer an ending wrapped up neatly, a triumphant escape from this nightmare. But I remain here, haunted by 4 absent silhouettes that could reappear at any time. Every day I think of packing my belongings and leaving, yet a force I can't describe keeps me tethered. My rational side says I should get help, perhaps from a friend or a professional. But something deep within me whispers that anyone else stepping inside these walls might be devoured by the same phenomena. I can't bear that risk, so I stay. When I manage to sleep, my dreams replay the moment the lamp burst, scattering shards of glass. I see myself thrown into the door, my silhouettes forming on the walls. continuing my work with perfect, eerie devotion. I wake up drenched in sweat, my heart thudding so hard I think it might burst through my ribs. Sometimes I check my palm, only to find fresh blood marking the exact same line. The house is feeding on my efforts, reaping the benefits of my labor each night. I sense the place growing stronger, the shadows waiting for me to falter. Although I remain physically unharmed beyond the scratches and the bleeding palm, my mind feels frayed. It's as if the house is shifting, realigning its walls and floors just out of sight. I can't confirm it, but my instincts insist that each day the corridor grows longer, and the windows loom taller. Each morning they gleam more brilliantly, reflecting a world that doesn't feel entirely mine. I'm not sure how this will end. There is no simple way to shake off these manifestations. Perhaps one day I'll muster the courage to leave and never return, or I'll find the secret behind those delayed shadows, confront them in whatever twilight space they inhabit. But for now, the only certainty is that when I wake up tomorrow, the vitros will be pristine. My hands will reek of chemicals, and the cut in my palm will bleed that red line from the inside out. I will stand in the hallway, breath tight, waiting to see if the silhouettes re-emerge to polish glass that only they can see. And I'll wonder again if I'm polishing the windows, or if they are polishing me away, little by little, until I'm nothing more than another echo on these walls. Story 8. I noticed his presence before I had the words to explain it. Even as far back as my earliest recollections, there was always a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, specifically behind the couch in my parents' living room. No one ever acknowledged him outright, and I never dared to point it out. Back then, I couldn't have understood the magnitude of what I was sensing. I only knew it made my skin crawl, sent my heart hammering against my ribs, and caused a thin film of sweat to break out on the back of my neck. That oppressive feeling lingered in the background of my life for years, simmering like an undercurrent of dread I could never fully escape. I'm a grown man now, living on my own, holding down a job that frequently demands I clock in earlier than I'd like. My apartment is small, just a living area with an attached kitchenette and a single bedroom. It's modest, but it's mine. I thought I had outgrown the presence that used to loom behind the couch. I assumed that whatever I'd felt when I was younger had simply dissipated, a phantom conjured by an overactive imagination. Yet something inexplicable drew me to an antique store one afternoon after work, weeks ago. My eyes fell on a worn armchair with faded burgundy upholstery and dark wooden feet. It reminded me of my parents' old set, the one from which I used to catch fleeting glimpses of that man in the hat. I should have walked away. I should have recognized the swirling heaviness in my gut as a warning. Instead, I found myself purchasing the chair and arranging delivery without quite understanding why. The first night it arrived, I positioned it near my own sofa. The plan was to create a cozy reading corner. The overhead light was dim, casting long shadows. I remember how the pattern of the fabric seemed to ripple in the half-light, its wrinkles forming shapes that pulled my attention. Goosebumps broke out along my arms, and my mouth went dry as I stood in silence, staring at what should have been an ordinary piece of furniture. My heart drummed an uncomfortable staccato against my ribcage. A twinge of panic fluttered in my chest, but I forced a laugh and tried to dismiss the sensation. Over the next few days, I noticed something unusual about that chair. Whenever I was rushed, those frantic mornings when I'd oversleep and dash around to get ready, the upholstery emitted a quiet, rhythmic creaking. It sounded like someone gently rocking back and forth, as though an invisible occupant leaned into it with deliberate pressure. Once or twice I whipped around, fully expecting to see a figure draped in shadows. I never caught anyone physically there, but the shift in the air felt almost tangible. My breathing quickened each time I heard it, and my fingertips tingled with that low-level buzz of adrenaline. I tried to convince myself it was the old wood settling, or the building's infrastructure groaning. But something in my gut knew better. One particularly frantic morning, I glimpsed movement on my smart TV's screen just as I was about to head out the door. I had set it up to display a live feed from a small camera in the living room, an extra precaution in my neighborhood. On the screen, the camera showed the exact same scene I was standing in, but with an impossible addition. A man in a wide-brimmed hat sat in the antique chair, posture upright, as if perusing a newspaper. Not an ordinary newspaper, my eyes could barely process what I was witnessing, but he appeared to be tracing his fingertips along the page, in patterns reminiscent of reading Braille. Yet in the actual living room, to the naked eye, there was no one there. My lungs froze, and an icy tremor rippled from my scalp down to my heels. My pulse throbbed in my throat so fiercely I worried I might pass out. For a dizzying moment, I considered calling out, demanding an explanation, but my voice caught in my chest. Instead, I tore my gaze from the TV and rushed out, half convinced I was losing my mind. That same day, I returned home exhausted, nerves stretched thin. I tried not to look at the TV at all. Instead, I deliberately avoided the living room, scurrying into my bedroom with the feeling that eyes were boring into my back. Sweat glued my shirt to my spine, and I could barely breathe. When I finally worked up the courage to step into the living room, everything seemed perfectly normal, but the stifling tension in the air was inescapable. My rational mind offered 100 possible explanations: glitchy streaming, an overactive imagination, stress. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was dangerously out of place. The very next morning, as I was running late again, I found something new and horrifying waiting for me. A cluster of X-ray films taped to my front door. My hands shook as I peeled them off. My vision blurred momentarily, and my heart rattled in my chest like a caged animal. Holding them against the light, I saw what appeared to be a fractured spinal column, bent severely at an L angle. The films looked old and yellowed at the edges, as if they'd been stored away for a long time. Worse yet, the shape of that spine, like a ragged question mark, sparked a visceral twinge in my own back. I felt a phantom ache in my lower vertebrae, as though my body was physically resonating with the injury. Nausea swelled in my gut. I wanted to kneel down right there in the hallway and retch. My rational brain tried to intervene again. Perhaps some neighbor left these by mistake. Maybe they're a leftover from a medical office. But I couldn't ignore the sense of personal menace emanating from them. A faint tremor coursed through my arms and legs. I felt every hair on the nape of my neck prickle with raw apprehension. Instead of investigating further, I stuffed them under my jacket and sprinted to my car. My only goal was to escape. Adrenaline choked my veins like cold sludge. Even as I drove, the images remained burned into my mind's eye, as though that crooked spine were superimposed on the road in front of me. My thoughts were frantic. Why an L-shaped break? Why leave them at my door? That evening, when I returned, I had the distinct feeling something, or someone, was waiting for me. The apartment building's hallway was too quiet, the flickering overhead light giving everything a jaundiced pallor. I stepped inside and stood perfectly still, listening. At first, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Then I caught it, the rhythmic creaking from the antique chair. It was more pronounced now, as if the occupant were shifting with greater urgency. An electric prickle crawled along my arms. My mouth went bone dry. Still, I forced myself to creep toward the living room. Before I could even glimpse the chair, the creaking morphed into something even more unsettling. A warped murmur, like voices run backward on an old tape player. The hair on my arms stood up in stiff peaks, and my stomach twisted painfully. I reached for the wall, needing physical support to stay upright. Step by step, I inched closer, bracing myself for what I might see. To my disquiet, the chair had moved a few inches away from its original spot. I knew its exact position down to the last detail. I'd measured everything to make sure it fit well with my limited space. Now, it was undeniably off-kilter, angled toward the sofa. My peripheral vision flickered, and I had the creeping sensation that something was peering at me from behind the couch, just like all those years ago. There was no shape or silhouette visible, but the presence was so powerful that it made my breath hitch in my throat. My eyes began to water from the tension of trying not to blink. The lamp nearest the sofa sputtered, casting brief strobes of light across the room, and in those flashes, I thought I saw a faint outline. A man wearing a hat, leaning forward as though to beckon me closer. My chest felt tight, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. The reversed voice murmuring continued, swelling and echoing in the corners of the room. Something primal in me snapped, and I retreated to my bedroom, slamming the door and flicking on every light I could find. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the shape behind the sofa creeping out, crossing the threshold of my bedroom door. My breaths came in short, ragged bursts, so loud I wondered if the neighbors could hear me. My mind reeled with questions. Was I hallucinating? Had I always been sensitive to something beyond normal perception? Or was this tangible proof of some supernatural force? Eventually, I dozed off just before dawn, only to bolt awake an hour later to the chime of my phone's alarm. My body was drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around my legs. My heart stuttered like a faulty engine. Out of sheer muscle memory, I got dressed. I couldn't even tell if I was truly awake or drifting in a nightmare. But responsibility forced me out the door. I feared another horrifying discovery taped to my entrance, yet the hallway was empty this time. A bizarre relief washed over me, but it did little to dispel the dread lodged in my gut. All day at work, I felt a lingering ache in my lower back, right where those x-rays showed that grisly fracture. Each time I shifted in my chair, I remembered the Braille newspaper, the man in the hat, the reversed voice murmuring. I was antsy and on edge, snapping at colleagues without meaning to, nearly knocking over a stack of files with my trembling hands. My boss asked if I was feeling okay, but I brushed it off, unable to even begin explaining what truly plagued me. That evening, I hesitated outside my apartment for a full minute before unlocking the door. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears that it drowned out the usual clatter of neighbors behind thin walls. One whiff of the stale indoor air brought everything rushing back. A pulse of cold dread coursed down my spine. Flicking on the lights, I scanned the living room. At first glance, it appeared everything was exactly as I left it. The antique chair, the sofa, the TV, all still. My anxiety flickered, not vanishing but hanging in the background like a storm cloud. I stepped forward cautiously, testing the floorboards for any sign of unusual vibrations. That was when I noticed the footprints in the dust on the edge of the rug. They were the distinctive shape of a man's dress shoe, imprints that led from the front of the chair around to the back of the sofa, where they simply stopped. The dust had been disturbed in a stark outline, as if someone with perfectly measured steps had walked behind the couch and vanished. My stomach lurched. A fine tremor spread through my arms and my teeth began to chatter involuntarily. The absolute finality of those footprints stopping behind the sofa was more chilling than a trail of them leading somewhere else. It confirmed that presence I'd always felt, the one that had haunted my peripheral vision for so many years. Only now it was undeniable. My mind raced with conflicting impulses. One urged me to flee and never return, maybe check into a motel or move across the country if I had to. Another urged me to confront it, to call out to whatever lurked behind that couch. My heart hammered in my chest, making each breath a labor. A cold sweat coated my forehead, and I realized my hands were shaking so badly I could barely form fists. I stood there, torn between self-preservation and a desperate need for answers. In that moment, I felt a sharp, needle-like pain in my lower spine. My knees nearly buckled. A wave of vertigo swept through me, and I had to grip the back of the sofa for balance. The second my palm touched the worn fabric, I felt a static shock, a brief jolt of electricity that traveled from my hand straight into my chest, leaving me breathless. My mind conjured an image of the X-ray, that hideously bent L shape. The mild ache I'd felt at work grew into an almost paralyzing sensation, like my vertebrae might just snap if I twisted the wrong way. Something in me snapped psychologically as well. Rage, fear, desperation. I felt them all coil into a single point of savage determination. I yanked the couch forward, half expecting to see the man crouching in the shadows, but behind it lay only the wall and a faint scattering of dust. My heart banged thunderously in my chest, and I was panting like I'd run a marathon. I circled around to the front of the sofa. The footprints remained, ending exactly where I stood. The lamp overhead began to hum and flicker, plunging the room into half-darkness. then lighting it again in fits. Each flicker pricked my nerves like a needle sliding under my fingernails. I glanced at the antique chair, my ill-advised purchase. Its seat cushion was depressed, as if occupied by invisible weight. Before my eyes, the cushion slowly regained its shape, puffing up as though someone had just stood and left the room. The reversed murmuring seized my ears again, that disorienting jumble of sound scraping against my mind. The pitch rose, and I had to press my palms against my ears to block it out. In the midst of that audial chaos, I felt a presence move past me, a shift in the air so palpable it made my hair flutter. I twisted around and saw nothing, yet every instinct told me I was not alone. My heart hammered with renewed force. My tongue felt heavy and thick, as if my entire body were vibrating with dread. The footprints in the dust seemed to morph in the flickering light, as though fresh prints were being laid down one after another, circling the sofa. I staggered away, trying to breathe through the suffocating sense of panic. I forced myself to think. I wouldn't allow this presence to hold me hostage in my own home. Summoning every bit of courage, I brushed past the antique chair, yanked open the door, and stumbled into the hallway. Even as I left, I could still hear the reversed voice murmuring, but it seemed subdued, receding behind the closed door. Outside, in the corridor's fluorescent lighting, I finally exhaled a shaky breath. My face and hands were drenched in perspiration. My back still throbbed with that ominous ache. But at least I was out of the house. The next step was uncertain. I didn't have anywhere else to go, no family close by to take me in. But I was determined. I needed a final confrontation, or at least a shred of closure. After pacing the hallway and mustering my nerve, I stepped back inside. The living room was dark. I flicked on the overhead lamp, which glowed steady now, no flicker. The reversed murmur was gone, replaced by a silence so absolute it made my ears ring. But the footprints remained. The X-ray film still lay scattered on the coffee table where I'd dropped them earlier. The antique chair sat as innocently as any old piece of furniture. The bruise-like ache in my spine eased, replaced by a numb, pins and needles sensation. I took a tentative step forward, then another. My head buzzed with tension, every muscle ready to bolt at the slightest disturbance. But there was no more movement, no flicker of a figure, no creaking upholstery, no cryptic whisper. It felt like the apartment was waiting for something. I approached the chair cautiously, heart pounding. I knelt and pressed my palm against the cushion, half expecting to feel warmth or resistance. It was cool and unremarkable. When I finally rose, I glanced behind the couch and found only wall and dust. Nevertheless, I couldn't dismiss the footprints, the X-ray images, or the sightings on my TV. Reality had blurred in my home, revealing that I'd been living with something unexplainable for too long. I didn't sleep much that night, but somehow the oppressive force had receded. Or maybe it was coiling itself up, waiting for another chance to strike. In the interim, I stared at the shape of the chair by the dull glow of my kitchen light, heart still galloping, but not quite as violently. I felt on the edge of something, a revelation or a complete breakdown. For a moment, I wondered if that L-shaped spine was a warning of what could happen if I persisted in ignoring the truth. Or perhaps it was a symbol of my own vulnerabilities, my fear bent into a posture of subservience to this presence. Dawn came, painting thin stripes of gray across the wall. I was still perched on the sofa, eyes red and heavy with exhaustion. Every joint ached, and my pulse was a subdued drumbeat under my skin. Yet I felt a strange sense of resolve. I knew the man in the hat might still be here, lurking just beyond the corner of my vision. The footprints had not magically wiped away. I realized I could never fully rid myself of him, but I could refuse to be paralyzed by his presence. Eventually, I stood and walked around the apartment, opening each curtain, flooding the space with the weak morning light. The chair still loomed. The footprints remained. The memory of that reversed voice was forever imprinted on my mind. Although I suspected the presence might return the next time I wavered, I also felt a peculiar calm. I had faced it once and survived. I couldn't banish the creeping dread, but I could live in spite of it. As I write this now, my spine tingles with leftover tension, my mouth is dry, and I can still taste the metallic tang of fear on my tongue. Even so, there's a surreal clarity in acknowledging that some things are beyond explanation. My living room remains a place where the veil thins, where reality unravels just enough to reveal a lurking figure with a hat and a silent newspaper. Every so often, I'll hear the upholstery groan, or see something flicker in the corner of my eye, and I'll brace myself. A chill will coat my skin, and my heart will lurch. Yet no matter how close I come to cracking, I refuse to surrender to that sense of imminent doom. I endure, unsettled, but alive, and that, perhaps, is the most haunting truth of all. Story 9. I woke up this morning to the unsettling realization that I am no longer certain which thoughts in my mind are truly my own. My chest feels too tight, and my pulse pounds in my ears, as if every heartbeat is a warning. There's a taste of metal on my tongue, tangy, electric, like the residue of something I'd rather forget. I taste fear. The pale glow of dawn filtering through my curtains only intensifies the claustrophobic grip on my senses. I wish the light offered comfort, but it does not. It merely reveals all the shadows in starker contrast, reminding me that I am awake, I am here, and I must face another day of this haunting spectacle. I have been a collector of antique coins for years, but everything changed when I decided to use one particular silver coin as a makeshift pointer on a board I scribbled with letters and numbers. I'd gotten the idea from an old rumor about superstitious business owners who used game boards to make financial decisions. It was meant to be a quirk, an eccentric method to break creative ruts. Instead, I unleashed something I cannot fully explain. The very first time I placed that silver coin on the board, it slid on its own, spelling out my personal identification number in reverse. The coin had never been anything more than an antique curiosity, yet there it was, gliding across the cardboard surface without the slightest push from my fingertips. I was so startled that I nearly knocked the board off the table. Over time, I convinced myself the movement was some unconscious trick of my own muscles. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe my nerves or tension were causing imperceptible nudges, but each time it spelled my CPF backwards, my insides clenched. I felt a sharp ache in my gut whenever the final digits fell into place. It didn't help that the coin gave off a soft scraping sound, like metal nails on a chalkboard, every time it completed the sequence. I tried locking it away in a presentation case I keep for special coins, but it refused to stay put. I can still recall the slow click of the lock, followed by the sudden clatter as the lid flew open. The coin seemed to leap out, landing on its edge, spinning faster than should be physically possible. It made a shrill whining sound as it twirled, like the spinning of a saw blade, echoing through my living room. The noise set my teeth on edge, and I grew terrified that neighbors might hear, but no one ever came to check. Maybe the sound was only for my ears. Each spin of that coin spawned strange new debts in my bank account. I would receive notifications on my phone about overdue amounts from unknown sources. Sometimes I found envelopes in my mailbox, bank slips supposedly already paid, yet stamped with outstanding balance in glaring red ink. My banks couldn't trace the origin. The bureaucracy devolved into endless phone calls with stony-voiced employees who apologized without offering solutions. I started noticing the coin would vibrate in my pocket whenever a new debt appeared on my account, like it was feeding off my panic. Soon, my nights became oppressive, full of bizarre half-sounds and illusions. The coin would be safely stored, or so I thought, only for me to hear the sharp ping of metal scraping on wood. One evening, after an exhausting day spent negotiating with a banker, I discovered the coin had spun itself through my parquet floor. It had drilled a small circular hole, and around that opening, the wood was charred at the edges. I knelt by the jagged gap, heart hammering as if I were looking into the mouth of some pit. A chill ran up my arms. My breath came in quick gasps, and a line of cold sweat trickled down my back. I touched the blackened area with trembling fingertips, only to pull away when I felt an undeniable heat radiating from it. From that point forward, the coin never let me rest. Bills would arrive already marked as paid, yet they all demanded more money. My financial advisor tried to explain that perhaps a glitch in the system was repeatedly transferring partial amounts. Her voice was cautious, as if she suspected I might be intentionally withholding details. When I told her about the coin, she gave me a polite nod, but I saw the doubt in her eyes. I suspect she shared it with a colleague, quietly remarking that something was off about me. I heard no direct accusations, but the tone of her short remarks about unusual activity felt loaded with unease. Every day I felt more paranoid. My skin grew clammy at the slightest noise, like the rustle of curtains in a breeze, or the random hiss of the water heater. At night, the hiss would sometimes morph into a series of whispers that I could almost interpret. They sounded like muffled entreaties, words in a language I didn't fully understand, but still recognized bits of. I'd toss and turn, squinting in the darkness, telling myself it was just a trick of an exhausted mind. Then I would sense a presence looming at the foot of my bed, a faint shimmer in the corner of my vision. My heart would pound, saliva drying up in my mouth as though terror itself had stolen every drop of moisture. But when I switched on the lamp, there was nothing to see, only the drab outlines of furniture and the silent, spinning silver coin perched on the dresser. The most horrifying moment came when I woke one night drenched in sweat. My chest felt trapped in a vice, and a low pulsing hum filled the room. It was a haunting sound, like a faint ultrasound wave that made my temples throb. I realized that the coin was on my forehead. It pressed itself there, hot against my skin as if magnetized to my skull. For a second, panic overwhelmed me. I couldn't think or even breathe. My lungs refused to fill. I pried the coin away, wincing from the searing heat, and as I did, I felt something tear. There, on my forehead, was a patch of flesh bearing what seemed to be hundreds of minute distorted faces in bas relief. They trembled slightly, as if struggling to open their eyes. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the mirror in the half-light. My stomach lurched. I had to brace a hand against the sink to keep from collapsing. That was the closest I came to questioning my own sanity in a profound sense. For hours, I locked myself in the bathroom, running cold water and pressing a damp cloth to my forehead. Each time I looked, I saw those minuscule faces writhing, shifting in time with my pulse. By morning, the marks had faded into an angry red bruise, but the memory left me shaking. My thoughts raced, trying to figure out some rational explanation. The hum in my ears didn't stop. It resonated in my mind, making my vision swim. Days passed in a blur of anxiety. When I ventured outside, the city felt alien. Every face on the sidewalk seemed to glare at me, or so I believed. My nerves were so frayed that even the reflection of passing cars and shop windows felt like hostile eyes. My chest heaved with every breath as I shuffled along, trying to seem normal despite the dread curling in my gut. I made sure to carry the coin in a padded box inside my pocket, hoping that if I kept it close, it wouldn't wander off again. Yet that coin had a mind of its own. Sometimes I felt it vibrate, warming like a live ember, as though it hungered for direct contact with my skin. One afternoon, a colleague from work noticed my distress and asked if I was feeling ill. I only managed to say that I'd been dealing with some unusual stress. He hinted that if I needed time off, I should request it immediately, because I looked pale and exhausted. In a hushed tone, he added that he had overheard me muttering to myself at my desk, something about silver curses and unexplainable debts. He was concerned, but also uneasy. I realized then how deeply I was unraveling. Soon, the coin began calling to me in more insidious ways. I dreamt of an enormous black ledger in which my name was written repeatedly. The pages turned by themselves in the gloom. Each page was slightly moist to the touch, and the writing was in a strange, angular script that flickered like living fire. When I awoke, that same humming vibrated through the darkness of my bedroom. I fumbled for the light, drenched in sweat, only to see the silver coin standing upright on my bedside table, spinning silently in place. My heart pounded so violently that I thought it might stop from sheer terror. Eventually, I decided to find some solution. I could no longer ignore what was happening. After a frantic search online, I located a small group of antique enthusiasts who occasionally talked about cursed objects, though they didn't call them curses outright. They mentioned residual energies and malevolent attachments. One weekend, I attended a gathering at a dimly lit local cafe. The air in there smelled of burnt coffee beans and musty books. People whispered about objects with questionable histories, but nothing matched the bizarre specifics of my coin's behavior. When I tried to describe it, I felt the group's uneasy stares. They offered disclaimers about mental well-being. One individual quietly suggested that some cursed coins might be linked to ancient rites or sinister intentions from a previous owner. But no one had an actual solution besides getting rid of it. I laughed bitterly, though the sound caught in my throat, more like a choking gasp, because I had attempted that more than once. I'd tried burying the coin in the backyard late at night, my hands trembling as I dug into damp soil. I thought it was gone. The next morning, I found it on my kitchen counter, perched upright, spinning. Another time, I tried flinging it into the depths of a nearby canal. That same night, it appeared on my nightstand. By then, I stopped trying to discard it. The coin wouldn't let me separate from it. My thoughts turned grim. I speculated the coin might be shaping my destiny, controlling my finances, and binding me to something beyond my comprehension. The spinning episodes got worse. Every time it whirled, a new wave of negative statements hit my account. The stress was turning me into a recluse. My mailbox overflowed with red-stamped envelopes, and my phone would not stop buzzing with official-sounding messages about compliance or payment reminders. My nights were reduced to fitful half-sleep, my entire body drenched in perspiration. I felt constant trembling in my fingers, and it spread to my arms, then into my chest, like a wave of unstoppable dread. One night I finally snapped. My living room lights flickered as though there was a power surge, and the coin started spinning in the middle of the coffee table, scraping grooves into the wood. I felt the vibration in my bones, an unnerving hum that caused the furniture to rattle. My palms were slick with sweat, but I managed to pick the coin up. I ignored the intense heat against my skin. My vision blurred, and the air felt suffocating, yet I refused to let go. The coin bucked in my hand, twisting as if alive, but I clenched it with all the strength left in my trembling arm. My heart thumped in my chest, each beat a sharp spike of adrenaline. I thought the coin might fuse to my palm, branding me, sealing my fate. I stumbled toward my front door, hammered by an irrational certainty that I needed to leave the apartment. I could barely see straight, but I rushed outside, into the narrow hallway, then down the stairs. At street level, I almost doubled over, gasping for air. The coin continued to vibrate, sending painful shocks up my wrist. My breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. My mind reeled, but I focused on a single idea. I would confront the coin's hold right then and there. I held it up to my face, ignoring the curious stares of someone walking by. In my head, I demanded that it reveal its purpose. My lips moved, but I felt the words choke in my throat. I heard no direct answer, just that unearthly, pulsing hum. Yet, in that moment, I felt a shift inside my chest, as though a knot had loosened. My stomach churned, but my panic gave way to an unsettling clarity, like stepping outside of a smoke-filled room into crisp air. I turned to see the building's exterior lights flicker, and a sudden wave of static electricity crackled along the pavement. Then, just as abruptly, the coin's heat subsided. The vibrations eased. My breathing stabilized enough for me to straighten up. The tension in the air seemed to recede, leaving me drenched in perspiration under the flickering lamps. I looked at the coin, no longer spinning or scorching. It felt, for the first time in ages, like an ordinary piece of metal. I do not know what force I confronted that night. Perhaps it was some malevolent presence that found a conduit in that silver coin. Perhaps I was an unwitting participant in a game older than my comprehension. My ongoing debts didn't vanish, but they stopped multiplying. My accounts became stable again, although it took months to sort out all the false claims with various institutions. I still carry the coin, not out of choice, but out of a strange responsibility. Late at night, when silence engulfs my apartment, I sometimes hear a faint hum. My heart races, anticipating that spinning sound or the sight of it perched upright on the floor. But so far it remains dormant. The faint scar on my forehead holds the smallest trace of those tortured faces. In certain lighting, I still glimpse them, pressed against my skin, yearning to open their eyes. I've avoided sharing this detail with anyone, though. They would never believe me, or worse, they might believe me too well. Occasionally, I wake with a start, my chest rattling with the memory of that coin blazing hot against my brow, as if it wants to seal me again. In those moments, I sense something intangible, some residue of dread lurking just beyond the edges of perception, waiting for an opening in my mental armor. I wish I had a neat conclusion or a statement that all this was merely delusion. But I cannot dismiss the experiences etched into both my finances and my flesh. All I can do is live with the coin's presence, abiding by an unspoken truce. The weight of its metal is a constant reminder that fear can slip through the cracks of rational thought, binding itself to even the most mundane object. Although I no longer see it spinning in the darkness, I know deep down that it hasn't lost its power. It just chooses to remain still, for now. And every time I think of unlocking my coin case, I feel my heart accelerate and a thin line of perspiration break out on my neck. My senses sharpen, and my mind returns to the memory of that scorching seal on my forehead. In that memory, I hear the faint pulse of an otherworldly hum, echoing in the spaces of my darkest fears. Story 10. From the moment I first laid eyes on that jester-shaped music box, I felt an unsettling pang in my chest, as though a cold hand had reached inside me and squeezed my heart. Something about its painted grin and tilted head made the room feel skewed, like all the furniture was slightly off-kilter. Even in the well-lit foyer of my home, the box seemed to absorb shadows, casting them in angles that defied logic. I remember that sharp intake of breath I took upon hearing its initial chime. It was not a comforting lullaby, nor was it a simple mechanical tune. There was an undercurrent of something else in its music, a note that did not belong to any scale I recognized. It resonated in my bones long after the final chord faded. I never liked that box, yet I never managed to rid myself of it. It followed me from one shelf to another, from one room to another, as though it had its own sense of direction. And in a way it did. It could detect my deceptions, and it was not shy about announcing them. I discovered its peculiar talent in the most humiliating way. Months ago, I hosted a small gathering at my place, a casual evening with friends, colleagues, and neighbors. I had placed the jester box on a tall mantel, hoping to keep it out of sight. The gathering had a pleasant start, mild laughter and the muted clink of glasses. Conversation that was neither too deep nor too shallow. I was feeling confident, as the generous host should, but then someone asked about the box. I vaguely recall them remarking on its unusual craftsmanship. They wanted to see it up close. I tried to be dismissive. I offered a vague explanation that I had inherited it from a relative, but even those half-truths triggered a faint squeal from the jester. It was not loud enough to draw much attention at first, but I felt it land in the pit of my stomach. A wave of nervousness flashed across my chest. I had hoped the conversation would die there, that I could avoid deeper inquiries. But someone else pressed me for more details, and I lied again, saying I purchased it at an antique store far away, somewhere remote, probably out of business by now. The box erupted in a discordant jangle that shattered a crystal glass on the buffet table. The entire room fell silent in an instant, all eyes turning toward me as shards scattered across the hardwood floor. My guests stood there, too stunned to speak. In a trembling voice, I tried to laugh it off, claiming it must have been a fluke, but I could see the wariness in their faces. Some insisted that I demonstrate the jester's tune properly, as though maybe a full wind-up would resolve the weird glitch. When I touched the small metal key protruding from the jester's back, I felt a slight resistance. The gears inside protested with a squeak and a click, then launched into a melody so high-pitched and disharmonic that my ears started ringing. My eyes darted to the large mirror in the room, an antique piece that hung behind the dining table. Under the relentless screech of the jester box, the surface began to fracture in slender branching lines that seemed to spread with every twisted note. Suddenly, with one final wail, the melody ceased. In place of a perfect reflection, the mirror displayed all of us standing there, but our faces bore these unnaturally wide grins. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, or maybe the shock of the situation. Yet the warped reflection persisted. Our lips appeared carved into a permanent grin, stretched from ear to ear, more clownish than human. And the jester's reflection? It looked as though its painted face was bigger, looming behind me. I shut my eyes, took a deep breath, and opened them again. The mirror was now fully cracked, but the reflection was normal, at least for the moment. My heart hammered in my chest so loudly that I could feel the pulse in my temples. People began to chatter nervously. Some, in hushed tones, muttered that the box had caused the cracks. Others insisted it was some bizarre coincidence. I can't remember the exact phrasing of their words. I only recall a collective sense of dread that weighed on everyone. My palms were slick with sweat, and I mumbled assurances that I would take care of the situation. As the night wore on, the atmosphere never recovered. Guests drifted away earlier than usual, leaving behind a residue of fear and unanswered questions. Nobody demanded an explanation, yet they all left with suspicion in their eyes, avoiding direct goodbyes. The tension clung to me for hours afterward, and sleep was out of the question. My heart raced, and a clammy sweat coated my forehead as I stood in my living room in the aftermath. Shattered glass, spiderweb cracks running across the mirror, and that eerie jester box perched on the mantel with a silent grin. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly, each second jarring my nerves. A few days later, I decided I had to destroy the thing, or at least lock it away somewhere deep. I could not risk it humiliating me again, or worse, continuing to manipulate reality in ways I could not comprehend. It was late in the evening when I decided to take it to the basement. I chose that time because the darkness outside made it feel like nobody could see what I was doing. That was foolish, of course. No one would have cared anyway, but in my state of near paranoia, it seemed the only safe option. I clutched the box under my arm. Its wooden edges felt colder than they should have, as though it housed a chunk of ice at its center. I walked quietly down the creaking stairs into the basement, flipping on the single exposed light bulb at the bottom. The bulb cast a sickly yellow glow over the space, highlighting cobwebs in the corners and the shadow of the furnace in the back. The cement floor was stained with old paint spills and watermarks from a time before I purchased the house. It had an odd smell, damp, musty, and something else I could not place. A metallic tang, perhaps, from the corroded pipes or leftover chemicals stored in corners. As soon as I set the jester box on a workbench, a draft blew through the basement, making me shiver. The air felt charged, and I realized I was holding my breath. I rummaged through a nearby toolbox for a small hammer, intending to pry open the wooden shell. My idea was that if I destroyed the internal mechanism, maybe the unnatural hold it had on me would dissipate. My mouth was dry, and I could sense my heart rate increasing again. Every small creak from the house above seemed amplified, as though footsteps were following me around. A drop of sweat ran down my neck, and I tensed at the sensation. Gripping the hammer, I turned toward the box. That ridiculous grin on its jester face seemed to mock me. My hands trembled, and I tried to steady myself. Before I even raised the hammer, the jester's key turned on its own with a chilling click. The music started in a slow, atonal shuffle. My throat constricted, making it difficult to swallow. Despite my better judgment, I inched closer, drawn in by the mechanical tune. It felt like stepping into a dream where gravity could change at any moment. Then the music abruptly stopped, leaving only the echo of its final note. Before I could even exhale, a jarring screech replaced the silence, and I watched in disbelief as the ring of keys in my hand slipped free. They soared through the air as if pulled by invisible strings, swirling around each other until they formed a coil. In the flickering light, they looked like dancing metal snakes forging themselves into some twisted barrier. I stepped back, startled, and stumbled over a loose plank on the floor. My pulse drummed so fiercely that my arms and legs trembled. I scrambled upright, pressing my back against a cold stone wall. With a sinking sense of horror, I realized I was surrounded. The keys had arranged themselves in a circular pattern around me. They hovered, spinning in the stale air, forming what felt like an intangible barbed wire fence. I was trapped, and the only way through was to approach the jester box. The box itself began to shift. Its wooden mouth, which had always been painted in a slight grin, now creaked open. The gears within were visible, complex and polished, meshing in perfect synchronization. They glinted under the feeble light as they hammered a steady rhythm, like a metronome of dread. My breath hitched, and I felt a nauseating flutter in my stomach. My vision blurred at the edges, accompanied by a faint ringing in my ears that intensified with every mechanical pulse. Leaning forward, I saw what the gears were producing on the concrete floor, a series of deep scratches that formed a musical staff. It was as if each spinning cog carried a small chisel, carving lines into the cement with surgical precision. Splinters of stone and dust scattered, creating a pattern I recognized, bars of music. I flinched at the screech of metal against concrete, forcing my eyes away. When I dared look again, I realized the lines were words. My mind refused to process them at first, but as I focused, the message became clear. These were pacts, some sort of confidentiality agreements demanded by this infernal object. I felt my breath grow shallow, heart thumping so violently that each beat shook my ribcage. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My hands felt clammy, my fingers tingling with pins and needles. I had to read the text scrawled in broken stone, though every instinct told me to flee. The words promised that if I did not sign in blood, my blood, I would lose my voice forever. I could almost feel the box's hungry anticipation, as though it wanted me to speak more lies. The second I read the clause about silence, my throat seized up. I coughed, struggling to clear the dryness in my mouth, but no relief came. Panic surged like a jolt of electricity through my veins. I thought about calling for help, but who would I call? And how could I possibly explain my predicament? My mind flashed back to the mirror upstairs, cracked by the jester's shrill tune, reflecting those hideous clownish grins. Perhaps that was a warning. Now it wanted me to either sign its cursed contract or live in perpetual silence. My eyes stung with a sudden dryness. I was too terrified even to blink properly. Pressing my shaking hand to my throat, I tested my voice. I tried to speak a single word. My name, perhaps, but I managed only a whispered croak. It felt as though my voice were receding into an echo chamber deep within me. My entire body trembled with the sense of being on the brink of an abyss. Could I truly lose my ability to speak? Or was this just another manipulation, a twisted psychological trick? Swallowing was difficult, but I forced my eyes back to the staff carved into the floor. The lines were incomplete, awaiting my signature. The keys hovering around me glinted ominously, forming an unbroken circle. Each key turned slowly, like the teeth of a watchful predator. The jester's gears continued their rhythmic clicking, a hollow metallic heartbeat that pulsed with the same tempo as my terror. I considered my options. Destroying the box, from what I could see, was no simple matter. Even the suggestion of such an attempt had caused the keys to swirl into a barbed wire cage. If I lied to it, telling it I would do as it asked but intending to destroy it anyway, its vile mechanism would likely detect my deception and produce another round of ear-splitting chaos. The memory of shattered glass and the fractured mirror loomed in my mind. I thought about how easily it could break my mind, just as it had broken the fragile pieces of my home. Standing there, eyes darting from the swirling keys to the carved lines, I realized the gravity of the moment. Either I had to sign in blood or risk permanent silence. I tested my voice again, straining to utter a sentence. A harsh rasp was all I could manage. If I lost my ability to speak, would that be so terrible? I shuddered at the thought of being reduced to gestures and stifled screams. Still, the alternative, to offer my blood as a signature, felt like a submission to something far worse. It felt like forging a bond with an eldritch force. Perhaps that was the jester's true power, forging these intangible contracts that fed on secrets, ensuring I could never reveal the truth about its existence. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I braced myself against the wall to keep from sliding to the floor. My lungs ached for a deeper breath, but it felt like the basement air had grown too thin. A claustrophobic pressure weighed me down, my chest constricting with panic. The only steady sound was the mechanical clack of the box's gears, an unrelenting reminder of its demands. I forced myself to examine the circle of keys. They were floating in a pattern, but maybe there was a small gap, a place I could squeeze through if I timed it perfectly. My instincts told me that any sudden move might incite the jester to turn that swirl of keys into a flurry of razor-sharp projectiles. But the alternative was to stand there forever. Gathering every ounce of courage, I steadied my breathing as best I could. My entire body shook, and my vision had begun to tunnel from sheer panic. I took one trembling step forward, then another. The jester's eyes, painted though they were, seemed to follow me. The circle of keys shifted, adjusting to my movement. My heart pounded in my ears, and each exhale felt like it was draining the strength from my limbs. Another step, and I stood at the edge of that swirling barrier. I realized in that moment just how strong the jester's hold was. The circle of keys was not purely physical. There was a tension in the air itself, as if invisible threads tugged at my thoughts, trying to lure me back into compliance. My foot hovered over the threshold for what felt like an eternity. At that instant, the jester box belted out a piercing note, and a tonal shriek that rattled the light bulb overhead. It swung violently, casting distorted shadows across the walls. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound was inside my head, scraping against the delicate nerves behind my eyes. My mouth went completely dry. I clenched my teeth until I thought they might crack. The circle of keys spun faster, rising a few inches, forming a flickering metallic ring that threatened to close in on me. Desperation can unlock a hidden reservoir of willpower, and I felt it surge from the depths of my chest. Before I could second-guess myself, I lunged forward. The whirling keys grazed my shoulder, slicing through the fabric of my shirt and leaving a stinging line of pain. A small flash of warmth trickled down my arm. My entire body tensed, but I did not stop. I ran for the stairs, ignoring the muffled clang and screech of metal behind me. When I reached the steps, I felt the illusions unraveling. The swirling mass of keys dissipated with a final jangle, scattering across the floor. I risked a glance back. The jester box lay still on the workbench, its mouth now closed, and the staff carved into the concrete floor glowed faintly before flickering out. My throat burned, and my voice was still little more than a whisper. Yet I felt relief flooding my veins. Somehow I had broken the circle. I had not signed the pact, and I still had enough voice left to produce a hoarse cry. Bursting out of the basement, I locked the door behind me. I threw the key on the kitchen counter and leaned against the wall, gasping for air. My heart hammered so hard that I thought my ribs might crack under the force. A cold sweat had soaked my shirt. My shoulder throbbed where the keys had cut it. The house was eerily quiet. The overhead lights in the kitchen hummed softly, and for a moment, the banality of the modern world felt surreal after the horrors of that claustrophobic basement. Despite the pain and the persisting sense of dread, I felt triumphant. Briefly. I had escaped, though I had not destroyed the jester box, and I knew it remained down there, waiting. Its demands had not changed. Either I would sign its bizarre contract in blood, or risk losing my voice entirely. Even so, I decided I would not back down. My plan was to seal the basement door permanently, perhaps with bricks, plaster, and locks upon locks, anything to keep that abomination contained. Yet a thought nagged at me. Was it truly possible to lock away something that could turn keys against their owner? Sleep did not visit me that night. I propped a chair under the basement door handle, barricaded it with a heavy cabinet, then tried to calm my trembling limbs with hot tea. It didn't help. My heartbeat reverberated in my skull, and each creak of the house made me jump. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the jester's grin, or felt that metallic swirl of razor-sharp keys. My voice, hoarse from stress, barely formed coherent sounds. I caught sight of my reflection in a window and gasped. There was a flicker of that stretched grin, distorting my features for a split second before returning to normal. Was it just the darkness playing tricks on me? Or was the jester box still exerting its influence from below? The next morning, I forced myself to leave the house, to find some respite in fresh air. I realized my neighbors would sense something amiss if I acted too erratically. But the moment I stepped outside, the world seemed painfully bright and entirely indifferent to my plight. Normal life continued, people walking dogs, passing cars, the mundane hustle of a neighborhood morning. I couldn't help glancing back at my front door, certain that from some vantage point, the jester was watching me. Though I avoided conversation, a few acquaintances greeted me, and I responded in faint murmurs, half afraid to speak more than a word or two. My voice still felt compromised, as though invisible hands were constricting my throat. Whenever someone inquired if I felt well, I offered a polite nod. I refused to mention the jester box. After all, it thrived on lies, but I wasn't sure if telling the truth would be any safer. As I sit here writing these words, documenting everything while I still can, I feel that same oppressive weight pressing down on me. The basement door remains shut, barricaded, but I can't ignore the faint mechanical clicks I sometimes hear at night. When the house grows quiet, I swear I detect the distant whir of gears turning in slow, deliberate cycles. The jester is biding its time, no doubt. My throat constricts at the mere thought of going back down there, but each day that passes I sense the pact growing stronger. My voice falters more frequently, and in mirrors or reflective surfaces, I glimpse that hideous stitched grin lingering just below the surface of my own expression. I'm not certain what final choice I will make, but I know the box will not be satisfied forever. Perhaps I will summon the courage to smash it, risking its wrath, or perhaps in a moment of desperation, I will sign its contract in blood to preserve my voice. Neither option brings me peace. That is the nature of this jester box. It offers you two horrors, and whichever path you choose, you lose a part of yourself. Even if I do nothing, it remains below, a silent harbinger of my deepest fears and darkest secrets. For now, I exist in a fragile stalemate, each day weighed down by dread. Every small lie I might tell, even a polite exaggeration in casual conversation, could awaken the jester's cacophonous fury. And if that happens outside of these walls, then the glass around me, windows, car windshields, store displays, could shatter, leaving me exposed in a world that cannot possibly understand what hunts me. That is the truth of my life now, half lost between reality and a twisted realm governed by that grinning menace. So I wait here, listening to every creak, scanning every shadow for the faintest glimpse of motion. There is no rest, no sense of safety, only the oppressive certainty that something monstrous lurks below my floorboards, itching to rewrite the terms of my existence. I can practically hear the final chord, the one that will decide my fate, winding itself up in the clockwork nightmares of that jester's grin. Story 11. A single dissonant scratch in the silence can change how you perceive your own home. It's as if the quiet itself decides to broadcast some hidden frequency, a slow hum of tension that wraps around your chest and squeezes just enough to remind you that something is off. My first hint of this unspoken discord occurred when my cat, Smokey, was dozing peacefully on my lap in the dead of night. But I heard a second meow echoing from the laundry room. The sound was too real to ignore, and too unsettling to dismiss as mere imagination. Right then, a chill ran through my veins, and I remember blinking in confusion because Smokey couldn't possibly be in two places at once. Yet, the meow from the laundry was clear, insistent, and just slightly distorted, like a half-tuned radio broadcasting from behind a closed door. I'd been up late, streaming some mindless show in an attempt to unwind, so my senses were already dulled by fatigue. The notion that I might be hallucinating didn't seem far-fetched at the time, but curiosity compelled me to investigate. Smokey, content with the warmth of my body, barely stirred as I carefully lifted him off my lap and set him on the couch. My heart thudded in my chest, and a faint sheen of sweat gathered at my temples as I padded across the hallway. The laundry room door was ajar. A pale, flickering overhead light cast a dull glow onto the tiles. Upon pushing the door open, I discovered an odd series of dusty paw prints on the floor. They formed a seemingly perfect labyrinth, looping in on itself like some ancient puzzle etched onto the tiles with a finger dipped in ash. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't shake the impression that this strange pattern was deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, made those prints wanted me to see it. The trail led towards Smokey's food bowl. The bowl lay empty, which in itself wasn't unusual, but the footprints were unnerving. Something was off about their shape. They resembled a cat's tracks, yet the size and spacing felt subtly wrong, like an imitation made by something that only half understood how cats walk. I quickly filled the bowl, glancing over my shoulder as though expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes pinned on me from some unseen nook. The air in the laundry room felt stagnant, thick as if it were carrying an electrical charge. My skin prickled. After a moment, I returned to the living room and found Smokey still dozing. He blinked at me lazily, oblivious to the tension that had begun coiling in my stomach. That night, I wondered if I should block off the laundry room, but decided it was pointless. I chalked up the labyrinth of dust prints to my own tired mind, overanalyzing normal cat mischief. Yet, I couldn't fully relax. My heart beat in a staccato whenever I replayed that echoing meow in my head. It sounded too similar to Smokey's usual voice, but distorted, like a tape recording slowed down a fraction of a second. Sleep came fitfully, full of half-remembered dreams about labyrinths and swirling motes of dust. The next morning, I awoke with a lingering headache. My neck was stiff, and my eyes felt gritty. As I stumbled toward the kitchen, I noticed that Smokey's usual routine, meowing insistently for breakfast, was absent. He was perched on the arm of the sofa, staring at me in a way that suggested he'd been up much longer than I had. I instinctively glanced over at his food bowl and realized with a jolt that the bowl I had filled the night before wasn't just empty. It was gone altogether. The space where it had been was spotless, as if wiped clean. In its place lay a small clump of fur, twisted into a tight ball and giving off a faint metallic odor reminiscent of ozone. A wave of nausea swelled in my gut. I carefully picked up the clump of fur with a pair of kitchen tongs, holding it as far from my face as possible. The stench intensified once it was free from the floor. My eyes watered, and a bizarre tingling sensation itched across my palms, despite not touching it with my bare hands. Unsure what else to do, I dropped it in a plastic bag and sealed it, my mind buzzing with questions I was too unsettled to ask aloud. It became a pattern. I would set out 2 bowls of food, one for Smokey, one for the unknown presence. Come morning, Smokey's bowl would be partially eaten, just the way any normal cat might leave it. The other bowl would vanish, replaced by another tight ball of fur giving off that same electrical tang. I tried ignoring it, hoping some rational explanation would surface, but the more nights passed, the more my nerves frayed. Each morning I found my own footprints from the previous day, meticulously overlapped by new paw prints that never once intersected my tracks directly. It was as though something had gone out of its way to avoid stepping where I had stepped. My paranoia grew. I started recording audio in the laundry room overnight, but when I listened to the files, all I heard was a faint mechanical hum that rose and fell, as if some distant engine was idling and revving in the background. The next step was to scatter flour across the floor in hopes of capturing clearer prints. Come morning, the flour was disturbed in neat, curved paths, always circling around my own footprints, never crossing them. Those curved lines seemed to get bolder each time, to the point they resembled geometric shapes I couldn't immediately decipher. I looked at the chalky outlines with my stomach churning, the hair on the back of my neck standing at full attention. I started feeling watched at all hours. The worst moments were the quiet ones, when the house settled into its usual nighttime groans. I'd try to busy myself in the kitchen, but every so often I would pause, convinced I felt a second presence behind me, silent but perceptible, like a change in air pressure. My heart would pound so loudly I could feel each beat reverberating in my ears, and the breath would catch in my throat. Occasionally, I'd spin around, expecting to find something lurking in the shadows, but the room was always empty. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the soft flicker of a dying light bulb, and me alone with my sense of unease. My attempts at brushing off these occurrences as harmless coincidences waned one particularly oppressive night. I had trouble sleeping and ended up lying in bed long after midnight, listening to the muffled static of my own thoughts. Smokey was curled near my side, purring softly. A blanket of humidity clung to the walls. The window air conditioner hummed in the corner, casting a pale, sickly glow onto my floor. My breaths were shallow, forced. My eyes kept flickering around the dark bedroom, half expecting to see a silhouette gliding by. I had almost drifted off when I felt a sudden weight at the foot of the bed, a heavy, cold mass pressing down on the covers. My throat tightened, and my pulse sped up in an instant. I was paralyzed for a few seconds, fear sizzling along my spine. This weight was nothing like Smokey's usual gentle hop onto the mattress. It was metallic, unyielding, and it pulsed faintly, as though it contained some throbbing engine. Summoning the courage to move, I slowly extended my leg to feel it. My toes brushed something solid, freezing, with a faint vibration coursing through it. Instead of yielding like fur or flesh, it felt like brushed metal, strangely alive. That was when I heard a muted, distorted meow, except this time it wasn't coming from across the room. It resonated within my own chest. Panic flared hot and sharp through my body. My breaths turned frantic as I scrambled to hit the bedside lamp. A thin glow lit the bed, and in that split second, the weight disappeared. My covers lay flat, undisturbed aside from my own trembling. Smokey let out a low rumbling purr, apparently still dozing, but I could feel that my pulse was thundering. The meow that had echoed inside me felt like a direct intrusion, as if something had momentarily synced itself with my body. For the rest of the night, I couldn't risk shutting my eyes. I sat up against my headboard, hands clammy, heart pounding so fiercely it made my chest tighten. Every so often, I thought I heard a faint scraping, like claws on metal, or the hiss of static barely above the threshold of hearing. My imagination spiraled, conjuring images of a cat-shaped machine prowling the halls, leaving behind illusions of dusty footprints. Rationality waned in the face of the uncanny, and I caught myself questioning whether my real cat was truly real. Smokey still seemed genuine enough in his quiet, corporeal warmth, but there was now an unshakable sense that I was sharing my home with two cats, one made of flesh and fur, the other of steel and static. As the days passed, I grew jumpy. My appetite diminished, replaced by a constant jittery anxiety that made my mouth dry and my stomach knot. I'd hear random noises while showering, a squeak of the floorboards in the hallway, or a single meow that sounded just off from Smokey's usual tone. Turning the water off abruptly, I would step out, dripping and shivering, to find nothing there. Adrenaline would hum beneath my skin, as if my body refused to let its guard down even for a moment. My eyes stung from lack of sleep. I developed a habit of triple-checking each door before bed, even though I knew locks probably wouldn't keep out whatever this was. Conversations with friends became stilted. I felt compelled to share what was happening, but I also sensed that no one would believe me, so I ended up offering vague excuses when turning down invitations, claiming I needed personal time. In truth, I was terrified to leave the house overnight, worried that if I returned, I might find more unsettling changes, like scratched walls or missing possessions. The question that haunted me was what the second cat actually wanted. It took the food I offered and left behind those bizarre fur clumps, but to what end? One evening, I tried to summon the courage to track the phenomenon directly. I set up a small camera in the laundry room, aimed at the bowls. My plan was to catch some footage and hopefully get clarity. Yet, that night, while lying awake in bed, I heard an abrupt flurry of static from the living room. The air itself felt charged, as if a thunderstorm was looming overhead, and a dull ache formed behind my eyes. When I checked the camera in the morning, the memory card was corrupted, unreadable. The bowl intended for the intruder was gone once more, replaced by the usual twisted knot of fur, reeking of ozone. My frustration fused with dread, forming a toxic cocktail in my mind. Eventually, I reached a breaking point. I couldn't handle the mounting tension in my own home. The final straw came during another night of restless half-sleep. My body jolted awake to the unmistakable sensation of something mechanical pressing down on my sternum. My breathing turned shallow, as though each inhale had to struggle through a layer of static. A rumble vibrated in my bones, and I felt the cat echo meow reverberate inside my ribcage once more, as if my chest was serving as a hidden loudspeaker for an otherworldly broadcast. I bolted upright, drenched in sweat, my heart a wrecking ball in my chest. Smokey skittered off the bed, eyes wide with alarm. I flicked on the light to find no visible intruder. Yet, for those few seconds, I had been certain I was pinned by something that existed just beyond normal sight. Trembling, I clutched my blanket and forced air in and out of my lungs until the dizzy panic receded. The next day, I emptied the entire laundry room of anything I could remove. Baskets, detergents, half-empty bottles of fabric softener, stacking it all in the hallway to leave the space as bare as possible. Then, with Smokey locked safely in my bedroom, I opened every window in the house to let fresh air circulate. My hope was to cleanse the place of that stifling, electric tension. It helped, somewhat, to feel a breeze swirling through the corridors, ruffling the curtains and carrying out the stale hush that had settled over everything. That night, for the first time in weeks, I didn't refill the second bowl. I put food down for Smokey alone and tried to steel myself for whatever might happen. My nerves felt like exposed wires, sparking at the slightest provocation. Every creak of the house, every flicker of the light, every sigh of wind through the windows set me on edge. But I refused to relent. Whether it was a supernatural entity, a glitch in reality, or my own psyche fracturing under stress, I felt a flicker of defiance that made my hands tremble less. Morning came slowly. The anxious hours before dawn stretched on, but the hush in the house was somehow different. Not quite peaceful, but also not as hostile. When daylight finally seeped through the windows, I cautiously approached the laundry room. It stood empty, just as I'd left it. No mysterious footprints, no twisted fur, no missing bowl. My relief was tempered by unease. Though nothing had disturbed the space, I could almost sense a lingering presence, as if something were crouched on the edge of my perception, waiting. Even now, I don't know what truly happened in my house during those weeks. I'm left with the recollection of that meow echoing inside my chest, the memory of metal cold weight on my bed, and the labyrinth of footprints carefully avoiding my own tracks. Smokey goes about his life as though nothing changed, but I still catch him peering at corners of the room with wide, alert eyes, as if he hears something I can't. Late at night, if I focus on the silence too intensely, I still pick up that faint mechanical hum deep in the walls. It reminds me that some boundaries, once crossed, can't be fully closed again. I've tried to return to normal routines, but my house feels forever different, as though layered with a second blueprint that only reveals itself in fleeting glimpses. Sometimes I wonder if I should get rid of all the cat bowls and feed Smokey by hand, just to be certain no second meal sneaks out of sight. Other nights, I catch myself glancing at the laundry room door, half expecting to see swirling dust patterns or to hear that distorted meow from behind the walls. The memory alone is enough to raise goosebumps on my arms and tighten my throat. There's a subtle understanding I've reached. Whatever I encountered did not leave behind carnage or tragedy. It left behind doubt, an inescapable, chilling sense that reality can shift underfoot without warning. And in that uncertainty, fear lingers. Even as I go about my day, I sometimes feel a low rumble resonating in my bones, like an engine idling patiently on the other side of reality, waiting for the moment my guard drops. In those instances, I remember the electric scent of ozone, the silent overlap of footprints, and how it felt to have a phantom cat meow from within my own ribcage. I may never truly shake that final image, for it's the kind of horror that burrows into your core and waits, reminding you that some things are neither fully present nor fully absent. They exist between the cracks of ordinary life, just a hair's breadth away, close enough to reach out and brush against your chest with a metallic purr that you'll feel in your own heartbeat. Story 12. I remember the exact moment when my kitchen changed from a place of comfort into a stage for something that should not exist. The air felt wrong, thick and stale, like walking into a room that had been locked for decades. My heart pounded as though it was trying to break free from my chest. My breath came in short bursts, and my palms were already damp with sweat, leaving faint smudges on the counter. I had an uneasy sensation that I was no longer alone, even though I saw no one else around. The atmosphere itself felt watchful. In that stifling silence, I sensed the beginning of something terrible, something I could neither see nor fully comprehend. I was preparing meal containers in my cramped apartment kitchen, a routine I'd done countless times before. The light above me flickered every so often, casting the counters in sudden darkness. Each time it blinked, a subtle dread gripped me, as if in those split seconds of darkness, something might appear or shift just out of my sight. I could hear the old refrigerator humming in the corner, a monotonous drone that only intensified the claustrophobic setting. The dull hum was joined by the faint drip of the faucet, a steady metronome that matched the pounding in my ears. In that narrow room, even the faintest sound became magnified, echoing off the walls and fueling my growing paranoia. I'd been chopping vegetables with a knife that had gone well past its prime, its blade so worn that I had to apply more force than I was used to. My hands were already unsteady, partly from exhaustion and partly from a vague, creeping anxiety that had dogged me all evening. As I tried to slice through a particularly tough piece of meat, I felt my grip slip. The blade swung dangerously close to my left index finger, and at that exact moment, I felt an invisible palm shove me backward. It wasn't a gentle nudge or a breeze. It was forceful, tangible, like a person's hand pressing against my chest. My back hit the edge of the counter behind me with a thud that sent a spike of pain through my spine. The knife slipped from my hand and dropped to the floor, but not before its edge grazed the wooden counter, carving a jagged line into the surface. When I leaned forward to see the damage, I froze. The line etched into the wood wasn't random. It looked disturbingly similar to the pattern of an electrocardiogram, those familiar peaks and valleys that I'd seen on my last medical checkup. The shape was so precise that my stomach nodded with a sense of recognition. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breathing grew ragged. I kept thinking this had to be some bizarre coincidence, but the realization forced a tremor through me. I had no reason to replicate an ECG line in my kitchen counter, yet there it was, unmistakably matching the heartbeat record I'd studied in my latest exam results. I placed a trembling hand over the carved pattern, wondering if my fingers would confirm what my eyes refused to believe. The moment my palm touched the groove, I felt a distinct pulsing, steady, rhythmic, yet entirely foreign. My own heart thudded in my chest, but this was a second beat, alien to my body's natural tempo. The sensation flickered up my arm, making every hair on it stand on end. Cold sweat broke across my forehead. A wave of disorientation made the small kitchen spin. All the breath whooshed out of me in a shaky gasp, and I had to grip the counter to keep myself upright. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe my pulse was echoing through my palm, creating the illusion that the wood was beating. So I lifted my hand, exhaled, and placed it again. The pulse remained, separate from my own. It was deeper, heavier, like a giant heart far beneath the surface. My stomach churned with fear. I jerked my hand away, stumbling back as the overhead light flickered again. When the light stabilized, I felt as if the carving on the counter was mocking me with its impossible life. Attempting to calm myself, I grabbed the coarse sandpaper from a drawer. My plan was straightforward: sand the marking away and pretend this nightmare never happened. I turned on the small lamp over the counter for better illumination. My heart still pounded so hard my ears rang, but I set to work, pressing the sandpaper firmly against the carved ECG line. The second I began rubbing, the wood throbbed, a sickening motion like raw flesh flinching under pressure. The smell that rose to my nostrils was not the usual resinous scent of sanded wood. It was metallic, pungent, more akin to fresh meat. My stomach lurched, and I gagged as I stepped back, letting the sandpaper slip from my fingers. A wave of nausea washed over me, and the rotting meat stench persisted even after I turned on the exhaust fan. I forced myself to look at the counter. It remained unchanged, except that I could swear the indentation looked moist, almost glistening as though it had begun to sweat. My arms trembled uncontrollably, and my breath stuttered in my throat. Darkness pressed at the edges of my vision, spurred by the dread that had taken hold. I realized then that this thing, whatever it was, might be alive in some way beyond my understanding. I glanced around the tiny kitchen, hyper-aware of every shadow. I had the uncanny feeling that the walls were closing in, that the old pipes and cupboards were somehow bearing witness. I thought about calling a friend to come over, but I doubted I had the courage to explain what was happening. How could I express the notion that my kitchen counter was pulsing like a living organism? My voice would betray my disbelief. And who would believe me anyway? That night, I tried to continue my meal prep, but every few seconds my gaze drifted back to that ominous carving. The overhead light flickered again, casting an elongated shadow across the mark. The raw, meaty smell intensified until I couldn't bear it anymore. I covered the carving with a dish rag, trying to block it from sight. But as I lowered the rag, I felt a damp heat emanating from the spot, as though the wood itself had a fever. I left the kitchen in a hurry, turning off the lights and shutting the door behind me. Even then, it felt like the faint sound of a heartbeat followed me into the hallway. That night was the first time I had trouble sleeping in my own apartment. Lying in bed, every creak of the building made me jolt upright. My sweat-drenched sheets clung to me, and my heart raced as if I'd run miles. A few times I thought I heard something gently tapping against the wall. I tried to reassure myself that it was the pipes expanding or the wind against the window. But deep down, I suspected something else. I couldn't stop imagining that wooden ECG line pumping in the kitchen like a second heart, calling out to me in a silent, horrifying language. Morning brought no relief. When I trudged into the kitchen, I found my dish rag soaked in a foul, rust-colored fluid that dripped in a steady rhythm onto the tile floor. Each drop splattered with a soft pat-pat, forming tiny puddles that resembled small wooden hearts. Or at least, that's what my panicked mind kept telling me. I noticed how those droplets, once they hit the floor, congealed into shapes that looked too organic to be accidents of spilled liquid. My throat went dry as I tried to ignore the detail, but my eyes were fixed on it. I grabbed the rag between my thumb and index finger, my skin crawling at its slimy texture. The stench of iron, sharp and nauseating, washed over me. My vision blurred for a moment as I fought the urge to vomit. I managed to toss the rag in a bucket and tried mopping up the floor. The fluid left faint stains that looked almost vascular, like the branching lines you see in diagrams of veins. A wave of fresh terror swept through me. The lines were forming a grotesque mirror image of the carving on the counter. I wanted to escape, to leave the apartment entirely, but an odd sense of responsibility nagged at me. My job demanded I finish preparing meals, and I convinced myself that ignoring the problem might somehow make it go away. So I tried to keep my eyes off the counter. Throughout the day, though, I was acutely aware of it. The presence was like static electricity building in the air. Sometimes I thought I heard the wood shift, or that it emitted a faint wet sound like the squish of raw flesh being handled. Each time my pulse quickened, and sweat trickled down my spine in icy rivulets. At one point, I forced myself to have a quick phone call with a coworker, describing an issue with the power in my building. I implied I was feeling unwell, but avoided any detail about the real problem. The conversation felt surreal, each word weighted with dread I couldn't articulate. When the call ended, the oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. That night, exhaustion weighed on me, but sleep felt like a distant dream. I lay in bed with my heart thrashing in my chest, imagining that if I drifted off, I might wake to find the entire kitchen transformed into a pulsating creature. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that ECG line, glowing red in the dark. My rational mind told me I was safe in bed, but I sensed that the lines between reality and nightmare had blurred. In the earliest hours before dawn, I must have dozed off from sheer fatigue. I jerked awake to a soft, muffled thump. My entire body broke into a cold sweat as my feet hit the floor. Without turning on the lights, I made my way to the kitchen, adrenaline propelling me forward despite every instinct screaming to stop. My hands shook uncontrollably as I turned the doorknob. The darkness behind the door was so complete, I barely made out the vague outlines of the counter, but a low, resonant pulsation, like a deep heartbeat, vibrated in the air. I flicked on the overhead light, and my vision swam at what I saw. The original carving had widened. The cracks in the wood had become raw, fibrous strands that twitched like exposed tendons. They swayed gently, as if inhaling and exhaling in tandem with a hidden lung. The air reeked of copper and rotting protein. My legs nearly gave out, and I clutched the doorframe for support. Desperate and shaking, I found an old towel and draped it over the gaping wound in the counter. I felt an unsettling warmth radiating through the fabric. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw the fibers reach out, almost clinging to the towel like living tissue. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled out of the kitchen, determined not to look back. Morning arrived, bringing with it a gray light that leaked through the windows, turning my apartment into an oppressive, sickly panorama. My limbs felt heavy, as if anchored by dread. I forced myself to check the kitchen again, physically bracing as I pushed the door open. The towel was saturated in that same rust-colored fluid, dripping steadily onto the floor. The entire corner of the counter now looked darker, as if the stain was spreading beneath the varnish. The organic fibers had receded behind the wood, but I couldn't ignore the stench of raw meat, now so overpowering it made my eyes water. I couldn't stay there any longer. My mind roiled with frenzied thoughts. Was I losing my sanity, or had something truly monstrous taken root in my apartment? The trembling in my hands never stopped, and my heart pounded so violently I felt it might burst. A paranoid voice in my head wondered if I was somehow tied to this thing, that maybe my own fear was feeding it. In a flurry of panic, I threw open the windows, trying to dispel the odor, but the stale air seemed to cling to me, insinuating itself into every breath. I decided that I had to confront whatever was happening directly. Running away wouldn't solve anything. The idea of returning to find an even greater horror was unthinkable. So I pulled out my largest kitchen knife, the one I hadn't used in years. Despite its edge being sharper than the old dull blade, my hand trembled so badly that it was hard to hold. My own heartbeat roared in my ears, and it felt like a challenge just to breathe. With the knife gripped in both hands, I removed the towel from the carving, half expecting it to lunge at me. Beneath the stained fabric, the ECG pattern was more pronounced than ever, the wood looking bruised around the edges. Tiny pinholes dotted the surface, each exuding that rust-hued liquid in tiny droplets. My senses were overloaded. The metallic stench, the jagged texture beneath my fingertips, the suffocating closeness of the air. I pressed the knife into the carving, determined to cut out whatever was living inside this wood. The moment the blade touched it, a deep, resonant throb coursed through the countertop. My own heart felt as if it stuttered in response. The wood resisted with a spongy resilience, like cutting into thick muscle. My arms ached, and tears of frustration burned my eyes as I sawed into the living grain. For a second, I could have sworn I felt an actual pulse travel through the knife handle into my fingers. A primal surge of disgust and horror made me yank the knife out. My breathing was erratic, my vision blurred by fear and tears. The ECG line still throbbed, now oozing more of that foul, iron-scented fluid. Unable to force myself to continue, I stumbled back and dropped to the floor. My ears rang, and every fiber of my being was telling me to get away. In a last, desperate act, I grabbed a pouch of coarse salt from my cupboard and flung it over the carving, believing in some vague, half-remembered notion that salt could cleanse or at least stop unnatural things. As the crystals landed, the fluid sizzled and steamed, emitting a sour, bitter smell. The wood twitched violently, and I felt the entire counter reverberate beneath the weight of that tremor. My stomach churned with revulsion, but a tiny spark of triumph flickered in me when the oozing slowed, then stopped altogether. Even as I write this, my hands quiver, and my chest feels constricted. I left my apartment soon afterward, unable to stay a second longer in that suffocating place. I still don't know whether the salt truly halted whatever was inside that wood, or if it merely forced it into hiding. Some nights, I awaken drenched in sweat, sure that I can hear a distant pulse throbbing in the silence around me. My mind keeps replaying the moment I felt that invisible hand shove me away from the blade, a gesture that saved my finger but marked the beginning of a nightmare that has no neat explanation. Now, whenever I think about returning, I'm torn between a nauseating curiosity and raw terror. My last image of the kitchen is that salted carving, partially mutilated but still vibrating with a sinister life. The memory leaves a gnawing unease in my gut. Maybe I only postponed the inevitable. I can't shake the feeling that something is still there, waiting beneath the surface of the wood, biding its time. And the worst part is that I can't quite tell whether the heartbeat in my ears at night is mine, or the echo of something else, something I disturbed in that small kitchen, something that's never going to let me forget. Story 13. I first realized something was wrong with my bathroom mirror when I noticed the faint smudge of silver near the upper right corner. Just a tiny blemish, no larger than a fingerprint, but it caught my eye immediately. It was early morning, and a single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow that seemed to pulsate in time with my thudding heart. I remember standing there, my reflection dull, my eyes ringed with exhaustion, and running the tip of my index finger across the marred surface. A prick of cold raced up my hand, as if I'd touched some creeping frost. I couldn't have guessed back then that this small imperfection would soon become a portal to something beyond reason. But there I stood, half awake, shuddering from a sense of dread I couldn't place. My breath caught in my throat when I flicked on the faucet, only to watch silver rivulets twist down the corner of the mirror, vanishing the moment I blinked. It was the first clue that the mirror, my everyday companion in the most banal moments, was turning into something that observed me as much as I observed it. Sometime before that strange drip, I had begun writing my financial goals on the mirror with a dry erase marker. It felt silly at first, but I was desperate for a way to keep myself disciplined. Every time I used the bathroom, I'd see those numbers, my target savings, my budget breakdown, all the little personal targets I had to meet by month's end. Once I started, it became a ritual. Each morning, I'd stand there after a shower, take my marker, and update the figures for the day. It helped me stay accountable. Until, of course, it didn't. Because soon, without my permission, new figures would appear at exactly 5:55 a.m., mere seconds before my alarm shrilled. I'd jolt awake, half in a dream, feeling a chill in the pit of my stomach like I'd forgotten something vital. Padding to the bathroom in my slippers, I'd see it. Fresh lines, carefully aligned with my handwriting but not quite the same, forming amounts I was supposed to save. They were always strangely specific, like 5342 or 10709, and every time, I'd confirm those were the exact amounts I needed to set aside if I wanted to reach my financial goals. It terrified me how accurate these phantom corrections were. Every single time I followed the new instruction, the margin in my bank account improved, as though the numbers were steering me toward an eerie precision I couldn't logically explain. When I tried to ignore them out of sheer confusion, the markings started to transform. They would drip silver, sliding from the edges of the letters down toward the frame of the mirror. Sometimes I thought I could hear the faint tinkling sound of liquid metal hitting porcelain tile. My pulse would accelerate and my tongue would dry out. I often found myself swallowing hard, terrified of cleaning the mirror, worried that if I smeared away this strange presence, it might push back in some unknown, more violent way. One morning, I woke up in a cold sweat, unwilling to obey the newly appeared figures. I wanted to prove it was all a coincidence. I remember ripping open the bathroom door, flipping on the light, and finding not only the updated numbers in bright silver ink, but also a watery, dripping stain along the mirror's frame. Tiny beads of something that looked like liquid mercury trickled, making me uneasy with each drip. My chest felt tight, and I hesitated, but curiosity overcame me. I reached out to wipe the metallic fluid away, and the moment it touched my skin, it burned hotter than any flame. I swear I heard a hiss and saw a sudden flare of bright silver coursing across my fingertip. Shocked, I dropped to my knees, cradling my hand, feeling my heartbeat throb in my ears. My breath came in ragged gasps. When I looked down, I saw purple welts etched into my palm and creeping up my wrist. They were shaped like letters I couldn't identify, some unknown script or twisted numbers. They glowed faintly before fading to a dull bruise. Even hours later, that area throbbed and tingled, as if the metal had found its way into my veins. I tried talking to someone about it, an old friend who worked at a financial firm. I didn't say the mirror was supernaturally guiding my savings. I just asked how he managed financial goals without losing his mind. His response was typical: keep notes, spreadsheets, reminders. But he gave me a strange look, like he suspected I was on the verge of a breakdown. I never told him about the searing mercury or the unnatural times. If I had, I imagined him nodding politely while backing away, questioning my sanity behind concerned eyes. Days passed. Each day the figure on the mirror updated itself, unwavering in its bizarre logic. I followed these instructions because each time I complied, the numbers matched my bank statements flawlessly. Despite the looming sense of dread, it was undeniably beneficial to my finances. But the cost was mental. My dreams became thick with claustrophobic corridors lined with mirrors. I'd see reflections of myself stepping in unison, each with a dissonant expression. Sometimes I'd sense something walking behind me in these dreams, a presence that whispered a language made of numbers. I'd wake in the middle of the night with my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. My pajamas would be soaked in cold sweat, and the air around me would feel suffocating, as though the walls were pressing inward. One night, I thought I heard a muffled scream from behind the bathroom door. I remember trembling, pressing my ear to the wood, hearing only the faint hum of silence on the other side. My mind raced with possibilities. Was the mirror able to project sounds, or was I losing my grip on reality? My scalp prickled with goosebumps. Every inch of my skin felt clammy. Unable to bear the tension, I flung the door open. The mirror was blank except for those silver-etched numbers, but something else caught my eye. Faint footprints, shaped like my own, trailing away from the bathroom tile and into the hallway, each glistening with silver residue. When I stepped closer, they vanished, as if my presence alone was enough to scare them into retreat. That night I barely slept, haunted by the idea that I was leaving footprints in my own home without realizing it, or that something else was mimicking my steps. It was about a week later, if I recall correctly, when everything escalated. The clock read 5:53 a.m. I was half awake, dreading the moment the mirror would conjure new numbers. My body felt rigid, as though I were bracing for an impact. The air felt charged, prickling my skin with static electricity. My mind was racing. I remember counting the seconds, my breath quickening, sweat beads pooling at my temples. Exactly at 5:55 a.m., I saw the mirror's surface glimmer under the faint light that seeped in from the hallway. I expected the usual shift in numbers, but instead the entire mirror started to ripple like a pond struck by a stone. I leaned forward, hands trembling. My vision blurred momentarily. A metallic smell, sharp and pungent, filled the bathroom. And then, before my astonished eyes, the mirror began dissolving from the outer edges inward, the glass liquefying into ribbons of silver that slid down the frame. It looked like molten metal, swirling and pooling onto the floor but not splashing or spreading, simply vanishing before it could hit the tiles. My mouth went dry, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, my breath coming in quick gasps. An unnatural cold seeped through the bathroom, making my teeth chatter despite the sweat that coated my forehead. As the central section of the mirror melted, it revealed something behind it. Not the chipped paint of my bathroom wall, but a corridor that stretched into impossible darkness. A faint neon glow emanated from flickering overhead lights that seemed to pulse with every beat of my heart. The corridor's walls looked like old brick, but everything was tinted with that same silver sheen, as if the entire hallway was an extension of the mirror's dimension. My stomach churned with a dread so deep it felt like gravity itself pulling me into a void. I moved closer, carefully placing one foot onto the edge of the bathtub, propping myself so I could peer inside. There, several meters down that endless hallway, was a figure hunched over another mirror, or maybe a tall pane of glass, furiously writing numbers. Its shape resembled me, from the cut of the hair to the stoop of the shoulders. My hands went numb as I tried to process the impossible. This other me was scribbling inverted digits, almost like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. And each time he pressed his marker to the glass, sparks of silver flickered, lighting the corridor in quick bursts that hurt my eyes. There was a pounding in my ears that drowned out everything else. I wanted to call out but found my throat too tight to make any sound. So I stepped into the bathroom properly, leaning half my body through the bizarre opening. The other me lifted his head as if sensing I was there. In that moment, I saw his eyes glint like polished steel. A surge of fear twisted my stomach. My heart hammered so powerfully that I could taste bile in my mouth. I tried to raise an arm, maybe to wave or to shield my face, but my limb felt weighted with lead. When that version of me resumed his frantic writing, I noticed the numbers were backward, not just reversed, but scrambled in a chaotic swirl. Something in my head screamed that if these numbers made their way onto my side of reality, my entire financial plan, my entire sense of order, might collapse into madness. I acted on pure panic, launching myself forward to grab the mirror or the figure, anything to stop this reversed script from manifesting. The corridor seemed to extend further the moment I moved. My foot slipped on the threshold, and my fingers only grazed the cold bricks. A jolt of something like electricity shot through me, making my muscles seize. Then, without warning, the corridor began collapsing on itself, not brick by brick but in a silent flash, like a zipper of light closing from the far end, swallowing everything in bright silver luminescence. My mirror counterpart glanced back at me. There was a flicker of expression, something between pity and fear. Then, with a final crackle, the corridor sealed shut, leaving me alone with only my reflection again. I stumbled backward, collapsing onto the bathroom floor, adrenaline making my heart pound so loudly I could barely think. My entire body trembled violently, as though caught in the throes of a fever dream. I must have blacked out for a few minutes. When I regained awareness, I was still on the cold tile. The mirror looked normal now, whole and unblemished, except for the faint silver numbers spelled out in my usual spot. My hand stung, and I saw fresh purple welts scrawled across my wrist. My breath sounded ragged to my own ears, and each inhale felt too cold, like I was gulping icy air. I forced myself to stand, gripping the sink for support. My knees shook, and my reflection stared back at me, half crazed, hair plastered to my forehead with sweat. I left the apartment that day, wandering aimlessly through the streets, trying to outrun the memory of that corridor. Bright daylight felt wrong, the sun's rays somehow lacking warmth. My mind kept replaying the image of that alternate me. Each time my chest tightened, and I had to swallow back rising panic. Eventually, I returned home, drawn by a sense of dread and an odd curiosity. Would the mirror be normal? Could I destroy it? Or was it forever changed? That night, I discovered another new horror. Inside my shoes, my everyday loafers, I felt something hard and oddly shaped pressing against my instep. I pulled them off, and out fell congealed lumps of metal, perfectly molded to the shape of my foot. They were formed into dense, shiny coins with my footprint design etched into them, as though hammered by an otherworldly mint. There were no visible numbers on these coins, but the second I placed them on the table, they emitted a faint ringing, like distant chimes. My blood ran cold. With each step I took around the apartment, I heard an echo behind me, the jingle of coins in an empty hallway. It made my hair stand on end, convinced someone was creeping up behind me, counting down the pennies of my sanity. Now, I live in a state of perpetual unease. I wake at 5:55 a.m. every morning, sometimes against my will, drawn to the mirror as though it commands me. The numbers continue to appear, guiding me toward financial decisions that are always on point. But behind every success, I sense the presence of that corridor, waiting for me. Every so often, I hear a scrape behind the glass, like nails on metal, or I catch a glimpse of silvery footprints fading in the periphery of my vision. My nights are filled with visions of that infinite hallway, my doppelganger scribbling in reverse. My body jolts awake in bed, soaked in sweat, the taste of copper on my tongue. My heart hammers so hard it feels like each beat might shatter my rib cage. I've questioned my sanity 100 times over. Am I hallucinating? Have I become so consumed by my financial obsession that I conjured this phantasm? Yet the purple scars on my hand are real, and the molded coins still clink in my shoes if I leave them overnight. I've tried throwing them away, but they reappear in some corner of the apartment, tinged with that faint silver hue, as if the very walls are spitting them back out. Once, I even considered smashing the mirror to pieces, but the mere thought made my heart race with unexplainable terror. Somehow, I know that breaking it would only unleash something worse, something that might drag me fully into that mirrored dimension, with no hope of returning. Even though I haven't found a definitive escape, I've developed a grim routine. Each morning, I wait for those silver digits to form, my pulse racing. I dutifully rewrite them in a notebook, transferring them from the mirror so I don't have to keep looking at their eerie glow. My skin prickles whenever I see the original writing shift into new shapes on the glass, as if it's alive, calculating my next move. And each day I notice a new detail in my bathroom. A suspicious flicker in the reflection, a fleeting silhouette behind my shoulder, or a faint metallic tang that clings to the air and settles on my tongue. My mirror has become a window to a place that defies everything I understand. Yet I cannot abandon it. Some twisted compulsion keeps me engaged, driven by fear and the bizarre knowledge that these numbers always turn out correct. I don't know what waits for me beyond that corridor, if it ever reopens. The memory of it thrums in my veins, a silent promise of a confrontation that hasn't finished yet. Sometimes, late at night, I sit on the edge of my bed, breathing shallowly, hearing the low hum of something pressing against the mirror from the other side. My reflection in the darkness seems to move a half-second slower than I do, its eyes flickering with that faint silver sheen. I wonder if someday I'll blink and find myself on the other side, scratching reversed numbers onto the glass, locked in a cycle I can't escape. Every step I take is a reminder. I feel the metallic shape of those melted coins in my shoes, pressed against my arches, as though forging a bond between my reality and that shimmering alternative. Each footstep echoes with the ghostly sound of future sums I haven't yet earned, and it reverberates in my skull like a prophecy. I find no comfort in it, only dread. It's a constant reminder that I am entangled in something that follows no natural laws, something that has invaded my everyday life through the unassuming surface of a bathroom mirror. And that is where I remain, stuck between a world I've known my whole life and another realm that defies every rule I cling to for sanity. When dawn breaks each day, I brace myself. 5:55 a.m. arrives without mercy, and I stand there, heart pounding, watching the silver script appear. The numbers shift and shimmer, promising me rewards if I follow their lead. But I can't shake the sensation that one morning I'll slip out of bed, approach that mirror, and find the corridor open again. And this time, maybe there won't be a chance to turn back. Maybe the mirror won't close. Maybe I'll stand face to face with that other me again, forced to see the reflection of all I've become. I don't have all the answers, and I'm no hero. I'm just a man trapped by an obligation he can't refuse, a covenant sealed by scorching mercury and financial precision. It's a terror that follows me even in daylight, worming its way into my mind with every ring of a cash register and every glimmer of silver in a dark corner. And I know, with a certainty that makes my blood run cold, that this is far from over. The mirror may lie dormant for hours, but at 5:55 a.m., it never fails. Whether I like it or not, my reflection is waiting, and so is that endless corridor just beyond the glass, promising revelations more horrifying than any number I've ever had to save.